Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second panel in the conference, Migration in the Americas, the Workings of Collective Hope. My name is José Miguel Cruz. I'm the Director of Research of the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center, and I welcome you all to this second panel. This second panel will focus on what is called the other or the many migrations in the Americas, right? In the first panel, we focus on the Central American migration. Now we're going to talk about some of the migrations or migration happening in the hemisphere, in the Americas. And we'll have a wonderful panel today. So I will introduce my fellow panelists in the order that they will speak. And before I move to that, let me remind our viewers and our listeners, our viewers not only in Zoom but also on Facebook, that we have, especially in Zoom, we have live translation, in live interpretation. You can see the channels of interpretation in the bottom of your screen. You can select English or Spanish. And please welcome or join me in welcoming our great panelists. So first we will hear from Professor Allison Wolf. Professor Wolf is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, where she teaches political philosophy, philosophy of immigration, and feminist philosophy. She is the author of Just Immigration in the Americas, a feminist account, and is currently co-editing an anthology entitled Incarnating Feelings, Constructing Communities Experiencing Emotions in the Americas Through Education, Violence, and Public Policy. Currently, Dr. Wolf is working on philosophical issues arising in the content of Venezuelan migration to Colombia, issues in feminist epistemology, especially related to epistemic oppression and feminist and skepticism, and obstetric violence in the context of immigration in the Americas. Welcome, Professor Wolf. Then we will hear from Professor Jonathan Hiskey. Professor Hiskey is Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University and my former teacher, and former maestro, with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Sociology. His research focuses on the role local politics play in the formation of democratic citizenry, I'm sorry for my English, across the emerging democracies of Latin America. His recent book, co-authored with Mason Mosley, Life in the Political Machine, explores the way in which some national dominant party enclaves in Mexico and Argentina shape the political attitudes and behaviors of their citizens. He received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, where he received the Gabriel A. Elmon Award from the American Political Science Association for Best Dissertation in Comparative Politics. Welcome, Professor Hiskey. And last but not least, we'll have Johanna Sáenz, who is also a political scientist with a minor in international relations from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana of Bogotá, and holds a master's degree in Latin American Studies from the same university. She has more than 14 years of work experience in the field of international migration. She has been an advisor to various institutions of the Colombian government and consultant to the International Organization for Migration, the International Labor Organization, the Pan American Development Foundation, and the World Bank. She's currently the Human Mobility Advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Regional Center of the United Nations Development Program. Gracias, Johanna, for being here. Thank you, Johanna, for being here. So we'll follow that same order. We'll start with Professor Wolf, then we'll hear from Professor Hiskey, and we will hear from Johanna Sáenz. So Professor Wolf, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And I, of course, want to begin by thanking particularly José Miguel for the invitation to participate in this wonderful event. And thank you to the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. It just it's just a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of fun to be here with such esteemed panelists, and I look forward to a nice conversation. And more than anything, I look forward to learning from everybody participating today. My area is philosophy. I'm a philosopher, so I think some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is a little distinct from, or it has a little different point of view, starting place than my fellow panelists do. So hopefully I can give some good information about what's happening here in Colombia in relation to Venezuelan migration, but also hopefully I can produce or provoke some good questions, because I think that one of the things that we need to do more of in migration studies is really to think more about some of these theoretical questions, because it's happening so fast and so many things are changing. So much of our time is spent just trying to get a hold of what's happening. we don't really get to ask some of these bigger questions. I'm hoping that we can do some of that today. So I'm just going to speak for about 15 minutes. That's my goal anyway, so that we have as much time for questions as possible. But I want to tell you a little bit about me, because I'm sure when you're listening to my accent and seeing me, you're not thinking that I'm Colombian, and you're right, of course. I am from the United States. I grew up in Los Angeles. I lived in the United States for my whole life until very recently. And I've spent a lot of time in Central America, and most of my focus was there. I came to Universidad de los Andes 3 years ago. And during that time, I started shifting my attention from migration in the United States of Latin American populations to what's going on in Colombia, which is increasingly, the numbers are just increasing. It's an increasingly common phenomenon that really wasn't even the case when I interviewed for the job. We didn't think I'd have so much work to do here. And so I just always want to give that disclaimer that I'm speaking as an outsider from within, in terms of how I'm interpreting what's happening in Colombia with respect to Venezuelans. And I think that perspective can bring us some good insights. So with that, I am going to share PowerPoint. I was joking with my other panelists that I'm a philosopher, we never do PowerPoints, but I had a feeling that there'd be PowerPoints here, so I decided to go for it. So what I'm going to talk about, and what I've been asked to talk about, really is my main area of engagement, which is immigration justice and injustice. And I look a lot at what immigration injustice is and isn't, and what policies are in place and how they work to either reflect or further immigration injustice in different ways that might not be obvious, because I take it as a given that those making policies have the best intentions. I'm just going to let that be. That I think is a better starting point to go from there, because I don't know all these politicians. And yet, even when they have the best of intentions, it's still the case that they can reflect or promote or make worse immigration justice in various areas. So I'm going to focus on the Venezuelan situation. And before we do, we have to have some definitions, because immigration injustice really has different meanings depending on your circle. And so I want to clarify how I'm using that term. In legal circles, immigration justice is fundamentally about protecting human rights, immigrants' human rights in particular. In my field, in Western philosophy, immigration justice is primarily construed as being connected to a nation's borders and admissions policies. So if you read philosophy in this area, a main debate will be about, should we have open borders or closed borders? And depending on somebody's perspective, the degree to which you do or don't have those things will determine whether or not a country's immigration policy is just or unjust. But I deviate from those positions, because to me, frankly, they're too abstract, and they don't really help guide us on what's happening in immigrants' everyday lives, which is what I'm really interested in doing, is understanding what's happening in immigrants' everyday lives and making those lives better, even if those lives are not being made perfect by some abstract standard. And so when I talk about immigration justice and injustice, what I'm going to be doing is talking about it in relation to oppression. And what I mean there is I think we should understand immigration justice as fundamentally being about identifying and resisting oppression in relation to immigration policies. And that means that we need to explore each policy, various policies, but also norms and practices that are more informal in relation to the degree to which they either help alleviate oppression in people's daily lives or make it worse. And so, of course, that means we have to talk about oppression. And I have this handy diagram. Some of you might be familiar with it from Marilyn Frye's metaphor on oppression of the bird cage. And very briefly, basically what Frye proposes is that we should imagine oppression to be sort of like a bird cage, in that it does not result from one thing or two things in isolation from each other. It's not random, it's not accidental, it's not avoidable, but rather oppression is the result of various forces and structures, networks, norms, practices, policies coming together to form a cage to trap those inside of it, such that they have no good options. And when we're talking about oppression in this case, what I'm talking about is how different immigration systems, practices, norms come together, work together in ways that actually make life harder for immigrant groups and those and other groups that might be that might be affected by immigration policy. And what's going to matter for us is that oppression takes various forms, okay? And some of those forms we call faces. I take a lot of these from Iris Marion Young, and exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism and xenophobia, systematic violence, and what Ann Cahill calls derivatization. And basically, I'm not going to go through these here, but the idea is that oppression could manifest itself in a number of ways, and any of those ways that you see on your screen would mean that if a policy promotes those or doesn't help them, then it is not actually helping to alleviate immigration injustice. And we're going to see some of these come back. So I wanted to just kind of forecast that. So with some of that kind of theory work in the background, I just want to talk very little, because I think Johanna is going to talk much more competently than I am about this in general terms, but I want to give us an idea of what's happening. So what's happening is that really Venezuelans have been migrating now to Colombia since Hugo Chavez assumed power, but what's gotten everyone's attention is the most recent group of arrivals, or as I prefer to call them, the most recent group of displaced Venezuelans, who have been coming to Colombia since 2016, 2017, 2018, and continued. And now there are an estimated 6 million Venezuelans who have had to flee their homeland. And that makes the Venezuelan situation the second largest human displacement in the world. Most of those displaced Venezuelans, roughly 5 million, have gone to Latin American and Caribbean nations, and almost 30% of them have come to Colombia, making this nation, where I have the pleasure of living, the primary recipient of Venezuelan nationals in Latin America and in the world. As of September 2020, though, as far as I can tell, the numbers haven't changed too much. Migración Colombia, the authorities on migration here in the country, estimate just over 1.7 million, maybe up to 1.8 million Venezuelan nationals living in the country. And of that group of the most recent arrivals, roughly fewer than 40% of them have a high school education, and the vast majority work in the informal economy, primarily in factories, agriculture, construction, door-to-door delivery, domestic labor, sex work, selling incidentals on street corners, begging, or exchanging work for housing. Now, Colombia was largely unprepared for this. There's lots of reasons for that. Colombia tends to see itself and has been primarily a country of emigration, sending about 10% of its own population lives abroad. And also Colombia has never actually had, unlike other Latin American countries, a major group of immigrants enter its nation. It has kind of its history is more of smaller groups who have come. And yet it's trying. Now, again, this is where you get my migrant perspective, right? I think I tend to see Colombia's response in a different light than some of my colleagues do, but I tend to take it, especially compared to US responses to migrants, as very, very positive. For example, Colombia has kept its borders open to Venezuelans until the COVID-19 pandemic. And you have to understand that Colombia's borders are very porous. To begin with, it makes no sense really to talk about a Colombian border because there are so many informal ways for Venezuelans to enter, but the official checkpoints remained open until the pandemic. Colombia is one of the few places that does not have birthright citizenship, and it has extended Colombian citizenship to children born of Venezuelan parents on Colombian soil. In 2017, it created a special permit for Venezuelan nationals, a Permiso Especial de Permanencia, which allows for its holders to work and access healthcare and education systems for up to 2 years. And most recently, about a year ago, the Colombian government announced and enacted a temporary protective status for up to 10 years for Venezuelans in the country, and it will be allowed to stand for any Venezuelan who enters through authorized channels before 2023. So Colombia is trying. And I think that's important because it gets back to what I said about intention, right? Like people, these are well-intended policies, and yet, as we're going to see, they are still reflective of and leading to or leaving intact various forms of immigration injustice against Venezuelan peoples. And I just want to look at two examples. One is a Colombian response, and the other is the international community's response, which I'm highly critical of, to be honest with you. I think that both of these things, what we're going to see is that they either let global oppression or they let oppression stand, or they make it worse. So before conclude, I'm actually gonna do this radical thing. I'm gonna shut my PowerPoint off, just talk to you like a person. And basically what I want to do is talk about two things in particular. One is the temporary protective status, and the second is the international response. So I want to be clear that the temporary protective status is a major step forward. It's certainly more than any other country has done. It's certainly more, I mean, people could say the United States has done this. That's nice. The United States has granted temporary status for up to 18 months, which is better than nothing. But really, Colombia is leading the world in the extension of the offer of temporary protective status for Colombians, to my mind. And yet, because of the kinds of problems that temporary status is meant to address, it's going to leave or even worsen other kinds of injustices that don't fall under that umbrella. And so, particularly, I want to focus on exploitation, xenophobia, and violence, because what the temporary protective status decree is really meant to do is legalize people, I hate that word, sorry, regularize people in ways that let them work in the formal sector, which sounds great. Except that there is no work in the formal sector, very little work. And so for the vast majority of Venezuelans, they are still going to be working, 90% in fact, work in the informal sector. And that means that they're still going to be paid less for the same job. And in fact, the Colombian Ministry of the Treasury reports that the wage gap is about 35% between Venezuelan workers and Colombian workers in the same jobs. Venezuelans often work longer hours in worse conditions, with a full-time Colombian employee working 44 hours a week and Venezuelans working 50 or more hours a week. They also don't get Social Security benefits or pension benefits. And regardless of the immigration status of the person, they're constantly in fear of threats of deportation and people calling authorities. And one of the problems of this statute is, for example, it says, we'll offer this at the discretion of the immigration authorities. So an immigration authority can just decide, well, no, now you're a threat, and take temporary status away from you. And so the idea that we're going to get better, that we're going to put people in a position of not having to face exploitative working conditions or threats of deportation because they have temporary protective status kind of depends on a false assumption that that temporary protective status is not able to be taken away. And there's a lot of legal ambiguity there to such that many migrants are worried, understandably, that it could be taken away, in which case they're still going to be vulnerable to similar working conditions and exploitative practices. Beyond that, there is an enormous and increasing amount of xenophobia against Venezuelans in Colombia. And you see this everywhere. You see it in graffiti that sprays. One of the things that's to me, the best part of Bogota is all the graffiti. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it's also very powerful politically. And you see fuera venezolanos or fuera venecos in all over. You also see memes, social media posts, Twitter posts that portray Venezuelan migrants as violent invaders flooding the country, portrays them as stealing Colombian jobs, as draining public resources, as not having proper values. There's a message, a meme that was on Twitter for a while that translates to "I'll pay 1 million Colombian pesos for," and 1 million Colombian pesos, you should know, is not very much in US dollars. It's like, what, $300 or something, for a Venezuelan to be killed by rats. That's just one of many, many, many kinds of memes. There's another one where they show an actor like kind of this relieved look on his face saying, and the caption is, "Oh, when you realize that you thought you hit a dog, but it was really a Venezuelan." So there's this increasing kind of violence, increasing xenophobia in the country. And so for as all the intention that may be there between the protective status, that just does nothing to address that. In fact, I would argue it's making some of this worse because people are like, well, there's protective status now, we don't have to do anything else. So that is another way that inadvertently we're getting more immigration injustice from these sorts of things. And the third area is violence. There is notorious violence that's well known by the government and other groups along the border region. Some of that, again, I feel almost uncomfortable talking in these terms because that implies the government has any sort of control over the border region or wants control over the border region, and it really does not. It's very much run by organized crime networks and other kinds of guerrillero groups, and they kidnap migrants, they force especially female migrants into sex work. There's constant sexual violence, but it's not limited to the border regions, as there are threats of kidnapping and extortion from criminal groups throughout the country. In 2018, Venezuela, there was a mob, for example, that attacked Venezuelan homes in Bogota because there were this baseless rumor that Venezuelan migrants were coming to kidnap Bogota's children. I think it was something like in May 2019 alone, there were 3 reported cases of trans women being shot by police, trans migrants being shot by police. And on an average, 1 Venezuelan died violently in Colombia every day in the first 8 months of 2019. These numbers are basically stable. There were 201 Venezuelan migrants murdered in September of 2020 alone. And so again, none of this is going to be addressed by the temporary status doctrine. And again, that's not the fault of the doctrine. It's just important for those of us who are trying to better the lives of Venezuelans to be like, great, that's one thing. But what's happening is there's so much acclaim for the temporary status agreement that people are just interpreting that as now it's just. Now everything's fair because they can be here, because Venezuelans can come and they can work and they can have access to everything. So our job is done. And so that's part of why I like changing the framework to oppression rather than human rights or other more formal mechanisms, because it forces us to look at the everyday conditions that are still plaguing this population, that are systematic, not accidental, not random, and not avoidable, that would have to be done before we could really say that we've hit a just situation. For 2 minutes before I conclude, I also want to strongly condemn the international response, or as I call the lack of international response, to help Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. That's not to say that there are not many nonprofit groups and other international organizations working to help Colombia and working to help Venezuelans, but it is to point out that compared to the way that the nations of the world have stepped up, for example, in the Ukrainian crisis, the way they have or have not stepped up in the Syrian crisis, it is just clear that the world is making a choice to not step up for Venezuelans. So where we have, in fact, I'm actually finishing up an article on this right now, like where we have the whole world like, oh God, we have to save the Ukrainians, which we do. In the meantime, the Brookings Institute calls the Venezuelan exodus the most underfunded humanitarian emergency in the history of the world. So it's something like where maybe there's thousands of dollars for every Syrian refugee. There are on average between $100 and $200 total spent on every displaced Venezuelan person. And where the United States has just announced accepting 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Again, I completely support that. They have maintained caps for Central American and Venezuelan migrants in place from the Trump administration with no real efforts to change them until it became Ukrainians, and they've denied the majority of Venezuelan applications into the United States. And what their main strategy is, and Europe's as well, is to send some money to Colombia, and basically just try to get Colombia to accept more and more and more Venezuelans without any financial assistance. So I think the latest UN number is almost 1.8 billion is the dollar figure needed. And between the United States and Europe, I think they've raised something like 600 million. And so I think that it's important that we realize that it's not just looking at what Colombia is doing, but what is the rest of the world doing? And how are those policies promoting immigration injustices? Because a lot of what's happening on the ground in Colombia cannot be dealt with the resources Colombia has. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that this is really something that we could be avoiding, but the world is choosing not to avoid it. And I think we should call the injustice what it is, which is oppression against Latin American peoples, against Latin American countries, and allowing it to mix with various political positions while we just leave millions of Venezuelans to fend for themselves. So anyway, I'm going to stop because I want to make sure my other panelists have plenty of time to talk and we have plenty of time to discuss. But hopefully that can give you a little bit of background of what's happening here, but also provoke some good questions for us to think about together, how we should approach it. So thank you again for the invitation, and yeah, I'm just going to be excited to listen to the rest now.
Thank you so much, Allison, for a very eye-opening presentation and presentation. Let me turn to Jonathan Hiskey, Professor Hiskey from Vanderbilt University, who will talk about another migration phenomenon. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. And thank you to you and the staff at the Latin American Caribbean Center for inviting me and putting on this really interesting conference. I do want to give a shout out to all of the people at FIU. I did my master's work at FIU back in 92, 93, interrupted by Hurricane Andrew, I will say. But it's been a while since I've been back, and I wish this were in person, but maybe next time on that one. But thank you guys. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the title of the talk is Changing Patterns of Mexican Migration, but I think I could have put a question mark there as well. There's some things that certainly changed over the years, but also some things that appear maybe to be remaining the same. You have here a picture of the Palacio Municipal de San Juan del Rio in the state of Oaxaca. This is where I got my start doing research on migration my interest in migration focused primarily on the impact of migration on sending communities like San Juan del Rio, the political implications of having 20–30% of your town's population living abroad, those sorts of things. But more recently, I've been focusing on the drivers of migration. So we'll talk a bit about that as it pertains to Mexico. Next slide, please. Okay, so just an overview of what I'm going to try to touch on. So we'll take a quick look at the numbers over the years in terms of Mexican migration, primarily to the US. Then I'll make a quick case for history mattering in terms of what these historical drivers of migration between Mexico and the US have been. Nothing earth-shattering there, I promise. And then we'll look at the period of change over the past 2 decades, starting in 2000, and try to understand some of the factors underlying those changes. And then we turn to 2021, 2021, where things have changed quite a bit. And we'll try to get our heads around what's been going on with those numbers. And then finally, I'll just have something very quickly to say about Mexico as a receiving country. This during Allison's talk, I was thinking about Mexico in somewhat the same situation, certainly not the same numbers, but being positioned as a receiving country in some ways, as well as a transit country in recent years. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to give you some numbers from different data sources about what's been happening with Mexican migration. So this is from the Pew Research Institute, and they have a methodology where they try to figure out how many Mexicans are entering into the US and how many Mexicans are leaving the US back to Mexico. So the orange bar is Mexico to the US, and the blue bar is US to Mexico. And what you see here captures, I think, fairly well what the other numbers suggest, which is we've seen a pretty dramatic change in the flows over the past 10–15 years. Starting in 2005, we start to see a shift to the point where estimates for the 2009–2014 period, and then subsequent to that, have been a net flow back to Mexico. And this just recently has changed with the 2018 period, suggesting that we're now seeing a bit more Mexicans coming in than leaving. Next slide, please. Okay, so switching to another data source, these are data from the Americas Barometer project that's done at Vanderbilt University, the Latin American Public Opinion Project. So over the years, we've measured immigration intentions across the Americas, and with the simple question, do you have plans to immigrate within the next 3 years? And what you can see here is Mexico, by and large, has remained fairly steady since 2004, with a notable uptick in the 2021 round, and we'll look at some other numbers that reflect that. And just for comparison's sake, I've provided you with the immigration intention among Hondurans, where, as you can see, in 2012, essentially the rates were about the same between the two countries, but we see this tremendous spike in intentions in Honduras taking place in the next decade, the previous 10 years, with an astounding 54% of respondents in 2021 saying that they had intentions to leave. Next slide, please. Okay, another way we kind of try to assess the migration and people's connection to it is by asking people if they receive remittances. And here again, I think the takeaway from this slide is, one, Mexico has been pretty steady over the past 15–20 years, hovering between 5 and 10% of the population reporting receiving remittances in the previous 12 months. And that's, again, in comparison to Honduras, where you have about 1 in 4 respondents reporting remittances. One point here, I think that this chart reflects is that, migration for the most part, over the past 2 decades, has not really been a national phenomenon in Mexico. That is, there's significant geographic concentrations of migration in certain parts of the country. And when we talk about the impact of migration and the impact of remittances, we have to remember that we're talking about 5 to 10% of the population who reports receiving these remittances, not 1 in 4 as we see in Honduras. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is a broad look, and we're switching data again. This is from CBP data and the Office of Immigration Statistics, but the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency provides, a wealth of data on apprehensions and such. And I have a few more things to say about that later, but the apprehension rate or the number of apprehensions is the best kind of proxy measure we have for the number of individuals that are crossing the U.S. border. And I want to note a couple things about this slide. Number one, prior to 2019, what we were seeing in Mexico is levels that we hadn't seen since the 1970s, right? So the peak of apprehensions at the U.S. border was in 2000, and in that year of 2000, 98%, actually more than 98% of those apprehended at the border were from Mexico, okay? And so I want you to keep this chart in mind. And so what the takeaway here is that since 2000, we have seen a dramatic decline in the number of Mexicans. And I'm sure most in the audience probably are aware of this trend. But the second thing I want to point out, just as it relates to using apprehension rates as a proxy for the number of people crossing, is that it's a very noisy measure, in part because the apprehension ratio or rate has improved quite a bit over the years. And one would hope, given the billions of dollars that the U.S. has invested in border security, that our ability to apprehend individuals crossing between ports of entry has improved as well. And CBP has a report on what their estimates for apprehension rates are, and they moved that number from around 50% in 2005 to about 70% in 2015. A big part of that is also that in the 2010-2020 period, many people were self-surrendering, as they say, and this is added. That person counts as an apprehension, but they're turning themselves in order to initiate the asylum process. So when we look at these numbers and the significant decline in apprehensions, we also have to remember that the apprehension rate has improved. So that suggests the numbers of people actually getting across between ports of entry has declined even steeper than what this chart suggests. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's take a closer look at those apprehension numbers. So this is from 2000. Yeah, this is from 2000 to 2021. A couple things to point out here. So the green line are those apprehended from Mexico. And as I said before, in 2000, the vast majority of individuals being apprehended at the border were from Mexico. And the other than Mexico category that the CBP uses was virtually, it was less than 2% of those numbers. In 2014, this kind of reached a watershed point of change with the other than Mexico category surpassing the number apprehended who were from Mexico. And as you can see, this orange line of other than Mexico increases, and this reflects what, again, many in the audience already know, which is the tremendous surge in Central American individuals from Central America that have been apprehended over the past 10 years. And then we have 2021 that we will grapple with in a few minutes. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a little deeper look at this from 2007. So we break down, here you have, again, the green line represents Mexican apprehensions And then the other three lines are Northern and Central American countries, blue Honduras, red Guatemala, and dark blue El Salvador. It's hard to get flag colors correlated with these lines because they all have the same colors. But anyway, so what we see here again is just the contribution of these three other than Mexico countries to the overall apprehension rate that prior to 2021 was kind of surpassed those of Mexico. Now, one aspect of 2021 that we're still trying to get our heads around is you see in the text box, the other than Mexico category, when we exclude Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico, of course, accounted for 367,000 individuals in 2021. So this reflects, again, what we all have kind of seen in the news of Haitians and Venezuelans and individuals from all over the world really arriving at the southwest border as well. But that other category, you can see the jump that took place between 2019 and 2021 in terms of the non-Northern Central American countries as part of that other category. Yeah, so this is one of the elements that we're, as I said, we're still trying to kind of figure out how to get a handle on. Next slide, please. All right, so this is another way to kind of look at these data in terms of who's arriving at the border and where Mexico fits in with the recent changes that we've seen. So I would say that in 2000, remember that 1.6 million individuals that were apprehended at the border, 98% of whom were Mexicans. The vast majority of those individuals tended to fit the kind of stereotype of an economic migrant, young, male, single, perhaps with a significant other, but their motivations largely, as best we can tell, were economic. Certainly, it's always a complex decision, but that's kind of as I said, the stereotype of the economic migrant. Over the past 20 years, this has changed quite a bit. So what we can see in the upper left-hand corner is unaccompanied children apprehended at the southwest border, the numbers there. And these other than these Northern Central American countries, that's what constituted the bulk of those numbers, with Mexico being, relatively flat until the last couple of years. Family units, same thing. You can see the flat line for Mexico, whereas with the other three countries, a significant component of individuals arriving at the border were in that category of family units, meaning one parent and one or more minors. And then finally, on the lower left side, we see single adult apprehensions at the southwest border. And we see from this chart that the dramatic increase in apprehensions of Mexicans at the border in 2021, a large chunk of that is represented by single adults, right? Or not single adults, adults. We're, what this suggests to me, and I'm very cautious at this point because we haven't really delved into the numbers enough to fully understand them. But what this suggests is, a largely kind of economically driven migration flow that's resulting from the tremendous economic crisis and that occurred during the pandemic. And the final chart you have here is just we could not get a breakdown by country of this, but in general, it suggests a growing percentage of female apprehensions along the border over the past 8-10 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarize what all these charts I've thrown at you is, prior to 2019, apprehensions were down to levels of 1970s. The annual apprehensions of Mexicans in particular went from, as I said, 1.6 million in 2000 to about 127,000 in 2017, which is just a remarkable decrease over 15, 20 years. And then, as I said, it increased to 608,000 in 2021. So we're still, we need to figure that out. Whereas apprehensions of Central Americans have increased, as again, many of you all know. Fundamental shift in what's happening at the Southwest border in terms of who's arriving, where they're coming from, why they are coming. And then I say until 2021. And again, we're trying to figure out what's going on there. Next slide, please. All right, so very quickly, I want to run through sources of this kind of historical stability of migration flows from Mexico, and then the changes that we've just looked at over the past 20 years. These include U.S. labor needs, macroeconomics, demographics, receiving country policy, and then the standard individual level factors that I'll touch on in a second. Next slide. All right, as I said, historically, migration has been a fairly concentrated phenomenon in Mexico, with the central western states being the primary sending states. This is circa 2003, so this is kind of what migration looked like, and these are the big sending states in Mexico. Next slide, please. Part of this, and this is a quick history tour. So in the 1920s, what were the U.S. labor needs? They sent recruiters down the railroads, and the railroads ended up in those central western states and recruited labor. And so it's no surprise that kind of the origins of some of the kind of traditional sending states trace back to the 1920s. And then next slide, please. And then we have the 1930s U.S. labor policy, which was kick all the Mexicans out. We're in a depression. As the sign says, we can't take care of our own. But U.S. officials slowly, maybe, were learning, maybe not at this time, but I think they've learned this now, that migration flows are not like a faucet. You can't turn it on and turn it off and prevent the water from flowing. Once you turn it on, it tends to keep on going. Then next slide, please. 1940s, U.S. labor needs changed again, and now we're recruiting Mexicans again with the Bracero program and the need for labor during the war period and the boom period after. So all of this is to suggest is that Mexican migration flows to the U.S. have very clear historical roots that persist well after the end of the policy in question. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn to why things have changed, why we see this significant decline in migration from Mexico over the past 20 years. Number one, macroeconomic trends. Generally speaking, Mexico's economy, with certainly some stumbles here and there, has grown in a positive way over the past 20, 30 years. And that is one of the aspects that's related to migration flows. Most importantly, some of those key migrant sending states have been among the most developed and prosperous states in economic terms. So next slide, please. That said, this gives you annual GDP growth over time in Mexico, and all of the dips that you see represent the economic crises that Mexico has gone through over the years from the 1980s, culminating in 2020 with a negative 9.2% contraction of the economy. And so we have that to kind of deal with as well. Next slide. The second factor is demographic trends. So the fertility rate in Mexico is replacing the population replacement level of 2.1. And you have the US as a comparison below, but this is, my demographer friends will tell you that this is the entire story about Mexican migration, that the supply of potential migrants has just simply gotten to the point where it's no longer going to be an issue heading into the future. So demography certainly has a big role to play in what we've seen over the past 20 years. Next slide. This is a comparison simply with the Northern Central American countries, and there again, with Guatemala lagging a bit behind, those countries too are heading in that same general direction, but probably, I would say 10, 15 years behind Mexico. Next slide. And then US policy has changed too over the past 20 years, where we've, with focus on Mexican migration, we've increased the number of H-2A visas that have gone to Mexicans. And as Philip Martin of UC Davis said, the bottom line is that we are replacing aging unauthorized farm workers with legal Mexican H-2As. And so that also has got, this recognition that we can legalize this migration relationship that we have with Mexico in ways that we have not done before. Next slide. Okay, now we go to individual level factors, and here's where the story really doesn't change that much. These are charts, the black bars, those the kind of drivers. If you are a remittance recipient, your tendency to want to think about migration is much higher. If you are male, it's much higher. The vertical axis here is migration intentions, and the age cohort that is most likely to migrate, as it's always been, is 18 to 25. And then education level tends to be around secondary or a little post-secondary in terms of wanting to migrate. Next slide. In 2021, initial analysis of these data that we have, the survey data, I have to give credit to Georgina Pizzolito of the LAPOP staff who did these analyses, but basically it's the usual suspects and then a few other things. Age, gender, education, all are connected with immigration intentions, having migration connections, having a friend or family living abroad, receiving remittances. Those have been standard throughout this time period. What has popped up that has not really been a factor in Mexico until 2021 have been these governance issues of corruption. Mexico now ranks first among the Americas Barometer countries surveyed across the Americas, with 25% of respondents reporting being victimized by corruption in 2021. Crime extortion rates, about 20% of respondents reported being victimized by extortion in 2018. And we know these are drivers of migration as well. And then finally, the economic crisis of 2020, where 26% of Mexicans reported incidents of food insecurity. 56% of respondents cited a lack of economic opportunity as the primary reason for considering immigration. So what this story tells us is that simply there are some factors that have remained the same in terms of what we're seeing in 2021, but with the additional elements of the pandemic-induced economic crisis, and then the continuation of crime and insecurity in the country. Next slide. Okay, and I don't have too much to say about this, but just to suggest that the drug war and all of that comes with it has potentially increasingly played a role in migration decisions among some Mexicans. What this chart is intended to highlight, though, is the geographic concentration of the drug war, where it has, and this is circa 2010, so it has spread since then, but I would say it's still somewhat concentrated in certain areas versus others. And so you have this kind of tendency of individuals maybe being able to emigrate to another country or wanting to, but also having a chance to internally move to another area of the country that is not facing the security crisis. Okay, next slide. I know I'm running out of time, but I'm almost done. So, okay, finally, the last thing is simply that immigration to Mexico has, as we all know, increased quite a bit over the past several years. This is a chart showing immigration numbers to Mexico from the various regions in the world, and the blue line obviously is made up primarily of Central Americans over the past 10 years. And so it poses the question of kind of putting Mexico in this new position as not only a transit country, not only a sending country, but also a receiving country. And again, with respect to Allison's presentation, the question becomes, what is happening? What is Mexico doing in terms of its role as a new receiving country over the past several years? And last slide, please. Okay, so just to sum up, Mexico, I would say by and large, migration flows are decreasing, notwithstanding what happened in 2021. And my expectation would be that those declining trends will continue into the future, maybe with a spike here and there based on whatever current events are going on. But demographic factors remain strong predictors of migration, and that's what kind of gives us confidence that the general trends will continue in Mexico. And then we have, as I said, the pandemic and the 2021 spike. And then finally, that the Mexican migration appears, even with that 2021 spike, to be largely distinct from what we're seeing come out of Central America in terms of the motivations and the drivers of that migration. Again, I hesitate to generalize too much on that, but that seems to be the case. And then finally, as I ended up with, Mexico as a receiving country and the questions and implications behind that new role for Mexico. With that, I'll end, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for a fascinating talk. I really didn't know, the differences between Mexico and Central America. For many years, I thought that they behaved in the same way. So thank you for that. Let me turn the floor then to Johanna Sáenz, who is the Regional Migration Advisor of the UNDP. Johanna, tenés la palabra.
Thank you so much, José Miguel. I'm going to do my presentation in Spanish, but before that, I just want to thank you and my colleagues Allison and Jonathan, and of course, all the FIU community for this invitation to this panel. And of course, for continue to promoting this kind of conversation, because, the human mobility is not anymore like an isolated phenomenon in Latin America. Is now part of our reality, and we need to continue talking and, of course, planning and implementing different actions as a response to these people on the move. So I'm going to, if you allow me, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to switch to Spanish. Muchas gracias. Entonces, un poco el interés y la idea de esta presentación es recoger parte de las reflexiones que tanto Allison como Jonathan han hecho anteriormente, pero tratar de dar una visión un poco más regional de qué es lo que está pasando en términos de migración en América Latina y el Caribe, y específicamente en los nuevos y más importantes cada vez flujos migratorios que se dan dentro de la región. Entonces, lo primero es simplemente un contexto, y es que, bueno, todos conocemos estos números de la migración a nivel internacional. La última información que tenemos proviene del Departamento de Estadísticas de las Naciones Unidas, y nos hablan de alrededor de 281 millones de migrantes a nivel internacional, de los cuales una parte importante, por supuesto, son mujeres, y con una presencia cada vez más importante de trabajadores migrantes. Y es un poco cómo se ve reflejado en nuestra región. Entonces, lo primero es considerar pues, que en América Latina tenemos 43 millones de migrantes, de los cuales, y además que tenemos más de 15 millones de migrantes de otros países viviendo en la región. Y ahora les voy a contar eso, lo que significa en términos de crecimiento en los últimos años. Adicionalmente tenemos 3 millones de migrantes extracontinentales, o sea, personas que no son de América Latina, pero que viven en nuestra región. Pero tenemos además otros flujos migratorios que son, por supuesto, pues mixtos, son diferentes, pero a la vez que complejizan la situación de la movilidad humana en la región. Y es que tenemos más de 700.000 migrantes en tránsito, lo que, digamos, se conoce comúnmente como las caravanas de migrantes o los migrantes que van caminando, tratando de llegar hacia Estados Unidos. Tenemos adicionalmente más de 980.000 personas que han sido deportadas desde Estados Unidos hacia los países del Triángulo Norte de Centroamérica en los últimos, desde el 2016 hasta 2021, en los últimos 5 años. Y adicionalmente tenemos más de 5.9 millones de trabajadores migrantes de América Latina. Las cifras, digamos, no podrán ser muy grandes, por supuesto, comparadas con nuestras cifras globales, pero para la región, digamos, para el número, digamos, de personas de la región, representan un número importante, pero adicionalmente representan retos tanto para los gobiernos como para las mismas sociedades latinoamericanas. Ahora, en términos de desplazamientos internos, refugio y asilo, pues claramente la situación no es diferente. Ustedes podrán ver aquí en las cifras que estoy presentando que en América Latina y el Caribe es muy particular. Si hablamos, por ejemplo, de estos altos, de los países que tienen mayor número de desplazados internos, casi que hay una lista muy grande de los países. Uno podría decir que el desplazamiento interno es un fenómeno, digamos, muy de América Latina, muy presente en la realidad de América Latina y el Caribe. Adicionalmente, digamos, tenemos un número importante de refugiados. El ACNUR calcula en alrededor de 1 millón las personas refugiadas desde América Latina, lo que excluye a los migrantes venezolanos. Tenemos alrededor de 18 millones de personas desplazadas internas en la región, y hay una situación muy particular, y es que las solicitudes de asilo en un país como México crecieron de una manera muy grande el último año. Y es que solamente México recibió más de 116.000 solicitudes de asilo en el año anterior, en el 2021. Lo tradicional que era que los latinoamericanos pidieran refugio o solicitaran la condición de refugio en otros países, la condición de asilo, perdón, en otros países de extracontinentales por fuera de América Latina y el Caribe, pero cada vez más los números al interior de la región han venido creciendo, y eso exige además para los países fortalecer todos los mecanismos de refugio, ¿cierto? De asistencia y de respuesta a la población refugiada. Otro dato importante acá es cómo precisamente ha crecido América Latina en comparación con las otras regiones del mundo. Y es que lo primero es entender que América Latina, por supuesto que tiene una tradición de emigración, las cifras lo demuestran, lo mencionaba Allison ahora, por ejemplo, en Colombia, por poner un caso, nosotros tenemos 10 millones, el 10% de la población colombiana, alrededor de 5 millones de personas viviendo en el exterior. Pero la cifra de inmigrantes se ha venido incrementando a raíz de la migración venezolana. Y eso no solamente le ha pasado a Colombia, sino le ha pasado a varios países de la región, y por supuesto no solo con la migración venezolana, sino con otros flujos que se han venido manteniendo y que se han venido además incrementando a causa, entre otras, de la pandemia del COVID-19. Entonces, América Latina duplicó el número de inmigrantes que tenía en su territorio del 2005 al 2020, y fue la región que más creció, pasando de 7 millones de inmigrantes a tener 15 millones de inmigrantes de la región dentro de su territorio. Ahora, Una cosa muy interesante es el tema de las remesas. Lo primero es decir que precisamente por la pandemia del COVID-19, por las imposibilidades que había de trabajar y por la afectación que el COVID-19 trajo a sectores donde tradicionalmente se ocupan los migrantes, por ejemplo, el sector del turismo, el sector de los servicios, todas las previsiones decían que las remesas iban a decaer. Pero lo interesante fue que en América Latina las remesas, los flujos de remesas crecieron y se incrementaron en un 21.6%. América Latina recibió en el 2021 126.000 millones de dólares en remesas y México mantuvo su primer lugar como el país que más recibe remesas al interior de la región, con el 42% del total. Y adicionalmente, digamos, las remesas siguieron representando, a pesar de, vuelvo e insisto, de todas las previsiones económicas en torno o a raíz del COVID-19, las remesas siguieron representando un porcentaje muy importante del Producto Interno Bruto de varios países de la región, y en algunos de ellos, como los que están mencionados en la lámina, representan las remesas más del 20% de ese Producto Interno Bruto a nivel pues de la economía nacional. Ahora bien, vamos a hacer una especie de enfoque subregional. Entonces vamos a revisar un poco qué ha pasado en América Latina y el Caribe en sus tres subregiones: Centroamérica, el Caribe y Suramérica. El panel anterior habló de Centroamérica, por eso acá voy a pasar un poco rápido, pero sí un poco haciendo también énfasis en algunos fenómenos que es importante, digamos, retomar. Lo primero es que la pandemia, por supuesto, del COVID-19 impactó la migración, la movilidad humana, digamos, en Centroamérica, y al mismo tiempo exacerbó e hizo cada vez más evidentes las vulnerabilidades sociales, por supuesto, de toda la sociedad, pero con mayor énfasis de los migrantes, incluidos esas personas que iban en tránsito. Entonces, un poco para que tengan idea de esto, es que los cierres de las fronteras, los cierres de los canales regulares de migración tuvieron un efecto negativo, y fue que impulsaron a las personas a salir cada vez más por canales irregulares e incluso por canales o por vías peligrosas. En América Latina y exclusivamente en Centroamérica, nosotros tenemos un corredor migratorio bastante, digamos, peligroso, que es este que se ubica acá en la zona del Darién, que es una zona selvática, en donde, que está ubicada entre Colombia y Panamá, y donde realmente sí los migrantes arriesgan su vida por, digamos, al cruzarla. Y ante el cierre de esas fronteras, lo que pasó fue que el canal del Darién se activó mucho más, haciendo, por supuesto, más evidente el tema de el tráfico de migrantes, la trata de personas, pero adicionalmente generando una presión muy importante en estas zonas de frontera que por lo general tienen poco desarrollo y poca presencia del Estado, y lo que pasaba era que los migrantes terminaban hacinándose, ¿sí?, en estas zonas, porque era cada vez más complicado pasar. Entonces eso, digamos, tuvo un efecto importante, y fueron elementos, o son elementos, que los gobiernos pues claramente tienen que empezar a considerar. Adicionalmente, digamos, otra cosa que sucedió en Centroamérica es que pues claramente seguía siendo evidente e importante el tema de la migración de centroamericanos hacia Estados Unidos, pero también empezaron o han terminado, digamos, recientemente sucedido fenómenos que incluso migración proveniente desde el Caribe termina también fortaleciendo estos o haciendo parte de estos corredores de migración y por supuesto generando una presión adicional a los gobiernos y por supuesto a nivel social en estos países centroamericanos. Uno de los casos más evidentes fue lo que pasó el año anterior con el tema de la migración proveniente de Haití. A raíz, digamos, de la situación política en este país. Y digamos que adicionalmente se ha hecho, digamos, cada vez más evidente que esta migración en Centroamérica hacia Estados Unidos tiene ahora un componente adicional y es el de los menores no acompañados. Tradicionalmente eran los hombres, cabezas de hogar, quienes migraban, pero digamos, al tener un papel importante la mujer y por supuesto también por un tema de violencia contra las mujeres y las niñas cada vez más exacerbada en Centroamérica, pues empezaron a migrar, pero ahora hemos visto es el fenómeno de las familias enviando a sus niños solos hacia Estados Unidos y eso pues por supuesto que dificulta y hace cada vez más compleja la situación en la subregión. Y finalmente, pues algo que no es ajeno, digamos, y que lo mencionaban también ahora mis colegas, y es que el cambio climático y los desastres como los huracanes, pues cada vez más influyen en el movimiento de personas de la subregión hacia Estados Unidos. Y por supuesto, digamos que han hecho o han propiciado que cada vez más sea más evidente la necesidad de trabajar de manera coordinada en estrategias de gestión y de respuesta a la migración de personas, pero en clave de cambio climático. Y es cómo las políticas y las acciones que se hagan para responder a los efectos de cambio climático, incluyendo, por ejemplo, el tema de prevención de desastres, deben tener sí o sí un componente de migración, un componente de movilidad humana, como una de las consecuencias casi que naturales de los fenómenos de cambio climático. Ahora un poco miremos qué ha estado pasando en el Caribe. Y allí un poco la idea es, digamos, partir del hecho de que, por supuesto, parte de las dinámicas, o más bien la dinámica del Caribe, de que la gran mayoría de su población sale, o sea, que la dinámica prominente sea la de la emigración, cada vez más el Caribe está recibiendo migrantes, en una parte importante, migrantes intrarregionales, o sea, del mismo Caribe. Se calcula que hay alrededor de 900,000 personas del Caribe viviendo en otro país de la subregión, pero adicionalmente la reciente llegada, y reciente me refiero a 3 años atrás, la reciente llegada de venezolanos al Caribe ha generado una serie de complejidades y ha exacerbado además unos sentimientos bastante complicados de manejar ligados a temas de xenofobia y discriminación en estos países en los países de esta región. Y es que han pasado cosas tan importantes como que, por ejemplo, en Aruba y Curazao, el 10% de la población total de sus países está compuesta por migrantes venezolanos. Y eso, por supuesto, que genera una tensión social, sobre todo, y eso lo ha generado, digamos, a lo largo y ancho de la región, porque América Latina no era una región que recibiera migrantes. Nosotros no estábamos preparados para eso. Y claramente la migración venezolana ha disparado una serie de situaciones que, por supuesto, han merecido y siguen mereciendo nuestra atención. Y otra dinámica muy importante en el Caribe es todo lo que tiene que ver con la trata de personas. Por supuesto, y a raíz, digamos, de todas las restricciones que hay de canales regulares para migrar, el tráfico de migrantes y la trata de personas siguen siendo una situación que se presenta de manera muy importante en el Caribe y que cada vez va, digamos, afectando a un número importante, sobre todo de mujeres adolescentes, y que además también genera unos desafíos en la región en términos de atención a las víctimas, pero también de judicialización de aquellas personas pues que incurren digamos, en este delito. Y bueno, un poco entonces, ¿qué pasa en Sudamérica? Y pues claramente que aquí lo que pasa en clave de migración proveniente de Venezuela. Entonces, un poco para que tengan idea de esto. A febrero del 2022, se calcula que más de 6 millones de personas han salido de Venezuela. 6 millones de personas que han salido desde el año 2016, es decir, en 6 años, 6 millones de personas. Pero de esas 6 millones de personas, el 85% se ha quedado en otros países de la región, y allí hay unas consideraciones, por ejemplo, de idioma, ¿sí? Pero también por supuesto, de cercanía cultural, lo que pasa con Colombia, pero también de la imposibilidad de muchos de estos migrantes de optar por canales regulares de migración, es decir, no pueden sacar un pasaporte y en ese orden de ideas pues no pueden tener una visa, luego no pueden tomar un avión e irse a otro país, como por ejemplo Estados Unidos o algún país europeo. Y de esos 6 millones, perdón, de migrantes que han salido de Venezuela, se calcula que el 33% están solo en Colombia, y si ustedes se fijan en la gráfica, la gran mayoría de estos migrantes venezolanos se concentran en lo que se conoce como los países andinos: Colombia, Perú, Ecuador y Chile. Y eso, insisto, para unos países como estos, que no estábamos acostumbrados a recibir migrantes, y menos en estas proporciones, se generan una serie de conflictividades sociales, como las que mencionaba Allison en su intervención, que merecen toda la atención de todos los actores involucrados. Ahora, ¿qué más pasa, digamos, o qué más está pasando en Sudamérica en términos de migración? Lo primero es que, digamos, por supuesto, e insisto en esto, el COVID-19 tuvo un efecto directo en temas de movilidad humana. Y Sudamérica, pues claramente no es la excepción a eso. Y aquí lo que pasa es que el COVID y los casos positivos de COVID-19 crecen de una manera acelerada. Un poco para que se hagan una idea, el primer caso de COVID-19 en América Latina digamos, oficializa en febrero del 2020 en Brasil, pero para junio de ese año, o sea, tan solo 5 meses después, América Latina era la región del mundo que tenía más casos positivos de COVID-19, lo que obliga a que todos los países de la subregión, pues de la región, cierren fronteras, y claramente esto también pasa en Sudamérica, y eso tiene unos efectos interesantes. Lo primero es que, por supuesto, hay una afectación al tema del empleo, lo que hace que los migrantes pues no perciban o no consigan los mismos recursos financieros que habían o que venían obteniendo, y se propicia una serie de intención de retorno. Entonces, por ejemplo, en Colombia se calcula que alrededor de 100.000 migrantes venezolanos deciden devolverse a Venezuela. Pero el problema es que la frontera estaba cerrada. Entonces lo que pasa es que esos 100.000 venezolanos se van quedando o se iban quedando de alguna manera atascados en las fronteras, generando una presión a los municipios, a los territorios colombianos de zona de frontera, que tenían muchísimos problemas y que tienen todavía muchos problemas en términos de infraestructura social. Adicionalmente, se produjeron, y no, eso no solamente le pasó a los venezolanos, muchos bolivianos que estaban en Chile también regresaron a Bolivia, peruanos que estaban en Chile también regresan, o que estaban en Brasil, regresan a Perú, y por lo general esto se hacía, por ejemplo, a pie, lo que además significó toda una serie de presiones a nivel, digamos, de la respuesta. Otra cosa, pues, por supuesto, que pasó es, pues, el tema de la migración venezolana empezó a generar además unas respuestas muy interesantes de diferentes países de la región. Y en América del Sur lo que sucede es que se apuesta a un tema de regularización, es decir, a brindarles a los migrantes venezolanos las posibilidades de acceder a un empleo formal, de acceder a educación, de poder estar, digamos, gozando de servicios de protección social. Y casi que Colombia es el referente, no solo regional, sino también global de estos ejercicios de regularización, pues como lo mencionaba Allison, con esta directiva que sale en abril del 2020, de 2021, perdón, de regularizar casi a 2 millones de venezolanos que se encuentran en el país por un periodo de 10 años. Y esta decisión de Colombia tiene un efecto dominó en otros países de la región, y entonces Perú empieza a buscar mecanismos de regularización, Ecuador también, pasan las fronteras y eso en República Dominicana, por ejemplo, también se empiezan a abrir canales de regularización, pero realmente, y si uno mira de manera objetiva el ejercicio de regularización, casi que termina o sigue siendo un reto, y sigue siendo un reto abrir esos canales para que las personas generen ingresos, pero también sigue o se abre además un reto adicional, y es qué pasa después del proceso de regularización, que es parte como de esas discusiones que se están teniendo a nivel regional. Y finalmente, pues claramente, y como lo he venido mencionando, pues los flujos migratorios intrarregionales crecen cada vez más en América del Sur, y hay una presencia muy importante de mujeres migrantes en esta subregión. Y eso se ve, por ejemplo, en la migración de Bolivia hacia Chile, por supuesto de Venezuela hacia Colombia, o de Colombia hacia Ecuador y Perú. Y es básicamente, por ejemplo, todo esto, esta migración femenina en torno a la economía del cuidado, es decir, a las mujeres que van a, por ejemplo, trabajar cuidando niños, cuidando ancianos, o incluso haciendo las labores domésticas en hogares de otros países latinoamericanos. Quisiera finalmente dejar unas consideraciones un poco como para abrir también la discusión. Lo primero es que si algo es evidente hoy en día en América Latina es que la movilidad humana y los flujos de desplazamiento tienen una perspectiva de mediano y largo plazo. Y lo decía yo al inicio de mi intervención. Esto no es una cosa temporal. Incluso en Colombia se hizo muy famoso una manifestación del presidente de la República recién empezado todo este proceso, de que decía que al régimen en Venezuela le quedaban pocas horas en el poder, y realmente han pasado años y seguirán pasando años, e incluso si el régimen de Venezuela hoy en día cae, el Banco Mundial calculó que Venezuela se demoraba 30 años en volver a ser el país que era antes del ascenso de Hugo Chávez al poder, lo que implica que por lo menos la migración venezolana, y por supuesto que los otros flujos migratorios, seguirán teniendo una presencia muy importante, y eso implica varias cosas. La primera es que la respuesta sí o sí debe dejar de ser exclusivamente humanitaria, y se deben empezar a involucrar respuestas desde el punto de vista del desarrollo, desde la perspectiva de la promoción del desarrollo y la cohesión social. Y lo segundo es que seguirá la movilidad humana exigiendo de los gobiernos y de las sociedades en la región resiliencia, flexibilidad y adaptabilidad. Es muy importante, y esto es un mensaje que siempre llevo a todos los espacios, que las respuestas que se den en términos de movilidad humana deben ser sacadas de la caja, es decir, no es simplemente lo mismo siempre y en el marco legal o hasta donde nos dé la ley, sino las respuestas realmente tienen que ser innovadoras y flexibles, entendiendo precisamente la particularidad de esta realidad migratoria. Lo segundo es que la migración o la movilidad humana no pasan en los países como un todo, realmente pasan es en los municipios. Pasa en el norte de Colombia, en La Guajira, pasa en Chiapas, en México, pasa en La Chorrera, entre Panamá y Costa Rica, y así en todos los municipios, ¿sí? de la región. Eso implica que la gestión migratoria debe tener una óptica de localización, de entender las dinámicas municipales y locales y de, por supuesto, apoyar a las autoridades locales, pero también a la comunidad, digamos, local que recibe migrantes, porque finalmente son ellos quienes hacen cara, ¿no? a la migración en un sentido inicial, pero también de largo plazo. Y finalmente, hay que tomar situaciones como la que pasó en el norte de Chile, en Iquique, donde las personas de chilenas allá en este municipio deciden un día quemar las casas o los lugares, no eran casas, quemar las tiendas de campaña donde se alojaban los migrantes venezolanos, o lo que pasó en Trinidad y Tobago recientemente también con unos migrantes venezolanos que iban en una balsa y que finalmente, digamos, fueron recibidos, digamos, con disparos desde la frontera o desde territorio, digamos, de Trinidad y Tobago. Hay que tomarlos como alertas, no como hechos aislados que suceden simplemente al norte de Chile y en una isla del Caribe como Trinidad y Tobago, sino como alertas de lo que puede pasar cuando no se responde de manera integral y coordinada al fenómeno migratorio. Los hechos de xenofobia, lo que nos estaba contando Allison, los grafitis o estos memes que se construyen para redes sociales que hay en Colombia en relación al tema de los venezolanos, o simplemente el tema de lo que pasa y el lenguaje como en el que se habla en los medios de comunicación frente a las poblaciones migrantes, son simplemente muestras de cómo la xenofobia y la discriminación han ido haciendo cada vez más campo en nuestras sociedades y de lo que significa entonces, o el reto que significa trabajar en la promoción de la cohesión social. Y yo creo que allí es básicamente el siguiente paso que tenemos que hacer. Ya entendimos que este es un tema que nos va a tocar manejar durante los próximos años en nuestra región. Ya empezamos a tener avances en temas de regularización, ya hay abiertos algunos canales de integración socioeconómica, pero realmente el tema hoy en día a considerar es la cohesión social como ese punto final, digamos, de trabajo en esta mirada de 360 grados a la respuesta de la movilidad humana en América Latina y el Caribe. Yo por ahora dejo acá y muchas gracias nuevamente por el espacio.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for a very comprehensive view, regional view of migration in the Americas. We are now, we are around exactly half an hour from the end of the panel, and so we have some time for questions from the public, for the audience. If I invite some people in the audience to submit their questions using the Q&A button, and while that happens, I have many questions for you. So hopefully we'll be able to you'll be able to respond to them. So for Allison, a couple of questions. That your description about the xenophobia, especially among the Colombian, in general, the Colombian public is striking to me, especially thinking that the Colombian government seems to have been more open, right, or the policies were more open to Venezuelans, at least in comparison with other governments, or what you usually see the the government responses in other countries tend to be more aligned to xenophobia than not, right? What would you explain? How would you explain sort of that such a difference? If I understood you well, and then a related question: to what extent you think that? Well, I know Colombia is on an electoral process right now, right? And to what extent do you think migration plays a role in has played a role in the campaign, right? So those two questions for you, Allison. For John, I also have a couple of questions. First, I find the whole demographic trends very interesting, right? And that seems to explain, you know, the apparent steadiness of the migration trend in Mexico during the last, you know, maybe 20 years. My question for you is, that means that Mexico is in the path to become the other big recipient country in North America, along with the US and Canada. So we're going to be talking about basically North America as the big recipient country, because if you look at big recipient region, right? Because if you look at the really demographic trend is exactly as, you know, almost in parallel with the US, right? So Mexico will need, you know, basically workforce, and it's needing workforce, and will need even more if those trends continue. So do you see this a future of Mexico in which they have this sort of these two trends, immigration and immigration at the same time happening? And another question for you. I mean, as I say, you were my teacher in political science, and we tended to view all these from the poli-sci view, right? And my question for you is, so it's undeniable right now that the world and the region also is turning more authoritarian, right? In general, right? And you have written about this, about how, you know, the political impact, or rather migration as a result of politics, right? So in this situation, in general, thinking more in terms of, in regional terms, how you see how do you see the immigration trends in the future, with so many countries turning authoritarian, including to some extent in Mexico, right? Or at least some populism in there in Mexico too. So democracy is not in its big time right now. It's rather the contrary. So how this will impact migration? And for Johanna, and I'm sorry for monopolizing all the questions, but in the meantime, I'm happy to make more questions. For Johanna, one of the things that I miss in the data that you presented is Brazil in some way. What I didn't see, maybe I missed it, I didn't see it, but it seemed to me that Brazil doesn't seem to be an important recipient of migration, right? Why, how would you explain that? You could expect Brazil being such a continent, basically, right? Huge country, with so many borders, with bordering almost any other country in South America, will be, you know, a big recipient of migration. But I didn't see that. It doesn't seem, in debates about migration in the South, you don't hear about that too much. So how would you explain those? So I will stop right now. I've been asking too many questions, so I'll give you the mic back to you guys, and I will start with John, just because I see him kind of more ready to this reaching out to the mouth. So
sure. Thanks, Jose Miguel. Okay, yeah, great questions, and to my fellow panelists, but I just really enjoyed both the presentations. So on the question of will Mexico be a receiving country in the future, given the trends I was talking about? I mean, I think at one level I would say absolutely yes. You know, you nailed it with the kind of indisputable fact that the labor force is going to need workers from somewhere, and you know, it seems to be a natural next step to become a receiving country. That said, you know, Mexico is one of those curious countries that has a mix of kind of the characteristics that set it up to be a receiving country, but at the same time, and this kind of relates to your next question, has many characteristics that you know, suggest that it will still be a sending country. And I think the way I resolve that is that Mexico is many Mexicos, that there will be parts of Mexico that will be receiving states, and there will be parts of Mexico that will be sending states, subnational states. And it is because Mexico is such a diverse country in terms of political characteristics, economic characteristics. You go down the line, and you know, the worlds of Oaxaca and Chiapas are fundamentally different from Nuevo León and the northern countries in some respects. And as I mentioned, the geography of violence in Mexico is very, very much a subnational phenomenon, just as the geography of economic growth and development. So I think, you know, probably the middle term, we will see both. And, you know, the one thing about Mexico, as I mentioned, is that it used to be that the US was the option. I think now you have internal migration as a viable option for people that are on the wrong sides of those development divides. And so we will see more internal migration as well, I would suspect, in the upcoming years. In terms of the political trends in the region, the kind of democratic backsliding, yeah, you know, I think we're seeing that play out in Nicaragua, where we've seen a tremendous increase in politically driven migration flows in recent years. And you know, with Mexico, I'm not so sure. AMLO is very popular. In El Salvador, migration rates are down very low because Bukele is very popular. You know, we'll see what happens over the next few months, but so I think it ultimately depends on the nature of authoritarianism, if it returns, the degree to which it is a populist authoritarian system versus one that has to resort to repression and kind of the old style tactics of military regimes of the past. That, to me, you know, I don't think migration is an automatic byproduct of authoritarianism per se. It's the nature of the authoritarian regime that I think is the driver. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. Mm-hmm. Allison?
Sure. Well, again, I just want to echo what Jonathan just said. I really learned a lot from his and from Johanna's presentation. So thank you for both of my co-panelists. And I really want to invite Johanna to complement what I say. It'll be interesting to see, because again, I'm going to give answers to your questions from a perspective of someone who lives in Colombia for a few years, but also is not from here. And I think that especially in politics, I tend to read things differently than my Colombian colleagues and friends do. And there's, I think, all sorts of reasons I do that. So I'll be very curious. But so your first question in terms of your observation of the difference between the government's response and the people's response, I think is stark. Now, this is something that fascinates me. I'm going to reveal some of my political colors here, because let's just say I would not at all pick this government to be good on migration, and yet I have to give it credit for being so. And at the same time, the mayors, right, who are much more aligned with my political universe, have frankly disappointed me deeply in terms of their response to the migrant situation. And so I think one thing that's interesting, just as an observation that I don't understand because I'm not a political scientist, but I think is fascinating to investigate, is why in Colombia are the migration policies so counterintuitively aligned with the professed political philosophy of those who are running, where you have a right-wing government who is promoting pro-migration policies, and you have left-wing mayors who are promoting xenophobia. To me, this is something I'm just fascinated. I keep trying to learn about it myself. But it's a fascinating phenomenon that, for example, as someone from the United States, you would tend not to see in the same way. Even if you would see, people on the right and the left, you do see like Republicans who are pro-immigration, you see Democrats who are disappointing on immigration. That's certainly, but not in the way that you see it in Colombia. And so I think that's just something to think about. Now, I do think that there is, so how do I explain it? One, I explain it via money. And what I mean is that it seems like the more inclusive the policies are, it seems that the more that the Duque administration offers some sort of regularization to Venezuelans, that seems to be the only way that the Colombian government can get aid. It's sort of what I was talking about at the end of my presentation, where the world seems, disgustingly slow to aid the Venezuelan population just because it's the right thing to do. And it seems like there's deals being cut. Like, hey, like in exchange for this, you're getting international praise. It also could be a distraction technique. There's a lot of deeply problematic things going on in Colombia on the domestic front in relation to the peace process and other such things. And maybe some of it's a distraction technique for that. It's like, we're not looking like, look at this great stuff they're doing on immigration over here. And now we're not looking at, murders of social justice activists and things like that. But honestly, I can't explain it, except that a classic conservative economic position requires free movement of people. And so maybe there's some more of that going on that we give credit for. So I don't know. I do find it fascinating. I also find it interesting where people are like where the xenophobia is concentrated and where it's not. I find it that like my friends who are more well off tend to express it more than say my students or my colleagues. So I that's another fascinating thing that I myself am still trying to figure out. In terms of the way immigration is involved in the campaign and the elections, I'm still trying to figure that out myself too. It doesn't seem to be the same way. It's certainly not like a Trump US kind of message, right? There's not someone who's like, their whole platform is anti-immigrant in the same way, or pro-immigrant the way it is in the United States. I hear things in the discourse that suggest hints. So for example, security. Security has a lot of meanings in Colombia, but I suspect one aspect of security in Colombia is an expansion of discussion from people's views on the peace process to also include the fact that they think there are too many migrants who are committing crimes, even though there's no evidence really to back that up. The other thing I hear as an outsider, and I say that on purpose because I think I'm not so sure people interpret it the same way from Colombia as I do. So Petro is the lead is the leading candidate right now, and there's a lot of people who are talking who are asking me, do you think Colombia will become Venezuela? And of course, there's a whole history of political discourse there around socialism and communism, and just the nature of the historically complicated relationship between Colombia and Venezuela that is behind that. But I'm also starting to wonder, based on some other conversations of will this force more immigration if we have a certain, if Petro wins, will people leave? Not so much are people going to come, but will people leave who don't want to leave as a result of this? And that's kind of an interesting dynamic, that's more of an immigration factor than an immigration factor that I don't think we're paying enough attention to. So those are just some of my initial thoughts. Like I said, I'd be interested to hear what Johanna thinks or what other people think about it. But I think those are some places I'm observing the things you're discussing.
Thank you, Allison. Johanna?
Gracias, José Miguel. Y sí quiero comentar algo de la pregunta y de la respuesta de este tema de Colombia que están hablando. Y lo voy a decir como colombiano, pero también como profesional, digamos, que ha trabajado toda su vida en temas de migración. Y lo primero que yo quisiera resaltar es que la posición de Colombia frente a la migración proveniente de Venezuela es tal vez el único punto en común que se puede encontrar entre el gobierno actual, que como Allison decía, es un gobierno de derecha, ¿sí? Y el gobierno anterior, que era un gobierno más de centro izquierda, que era el gobierno del presidente Juan Manuel Santos. El único punto en el que estuvieron de acuerdo los dos era en que teníamos que tener una política de recepción de población migrante venezolana. Pero a eso hay que ponerle un poco de maldad en la respuesta, y es, en realidad no es porque tenemos que ser buenos, ¿sí? O porque hace años fueron los venezolanos los que recibieron a los colombianos, sino porque en realidad esa posición ha sido muy estratégica a nivel de política exterior para Colombia. Y Colombia ha capitalizado esa posición en términos de, por ejemplo, y les voy a poner un ejemplo. El gobierno del presidente, el gobierno actual del presidente Duque, en abril del 2021 dice: voy a regularizar a los 2 millones de migrantes venezolanos que están en Colombia por 10 años. A los 15 días estaban anunciando diferentes gobiernos del mundo el apoyo a Colombia en términos de vacunas contra el COVID-19. Eso es estrategia. O sea, realmente hay que verlo de esa manera práctica, ¿sí? Y eso claramente ha abierto las puertas para, no solo en temas de vacunas contra el COVID-19, sino en otros temas que Colombia pueda capitalizar. Entonces yo creo que hay que entender también esa posición muy desde esa visión estratégica, y por eso también yo me atrevería a vaticinar que, independientemente del gobierno que llegue, sea un gobierno de izquierda, porque además tenemos unos candidatos muy polarizados, o el gobierno de izquierda o un gobierno de derecha, la posición frente a la migración venezolana no va a cambiar de manera radical, porque el costo político para Colombia a nivel exterior sería muy grande. Y con relación a lo que Allison mencionaba, tenemos un gobierno nacional muy abierto a la migración, pero unos gobiernos regionales o subnacionales más bien, al contrario, más bien como con características xenófobas y discriminatorias, lo cual es absolutamente cierto. Eso es un ejemplo perfecto de una cosa que yo mencionaba en mi intervención, y es que hay una ruptura entre la visión de lo nacional y la visión de lo local en términos de la gestión de la migración. Entonces aquí no hay puentes. O sea, el gobierno nacional dice: vamos a abrir la puerta a 2 millones de migrantes, pero no hay puentes de diálogo, ni de financiación, ni nada, para apoyar a los lugares, a los territorios donde están esos 2 millones de venezolanos. Entonces, eso muestra la necesidad, en serio, de un trabajo coordinado entre actores territoriales y actores nacionales. Ahora sí, respondiendo a la pregunta que me hicieron a mí, en términos de Brasil, y un poco así como decía Jonathan en su respuesta de México, que hay muchos Méxicos al interior de México, pues realmente Brasil es casi que un subcontinente al interior de América Latina. Y ahí hay varias consideraciones, José Miguel y quienes nos están escuchando. Lo primero que yo diría es que, bueno, evidentemente desde el punto de vista político, el gobierno de Jair Bolsonaro sí ha tenido una respuesta o una posición un poco más fuerte, restrictiva frente al tema de la migración. Digamos, desde inicios de su campaña política, él promovió un poco más como esta política migratoria fuerte, un poco más cerrada, y quizás un poco también más como identificando quién sí sería el que podría venir y quién no. Entonces hay una lógica, digamos, de política restrictiva que claramente hace que en Brasil no haya tantos migrantes. Y es que pensemos que a nivel comparativo, Brasil, como tú lo decías, José Miguel, un país tan grande y tan poblado, actualmente tan solo tiene 316,000 venezolanos viviendo en su territorio, comparados con los 2 millones que viven en Colombia, ¿sí? Con una población de 50 millones de habitantes, pues claramente la proporción en Brasil es muy mínima. Entonces, en primer lugar, esa política restrictiva desde el gobierno tiene una incidencia. Pero en segundo lugar, y así uno no creyera, el tema del idioma es una barrera. El migrante de América Latina, digamos, promedio, que claramente no habla portugués, pues no considera Brasil dentro de sus primeras opciones para migrar. Entonces, claramente allí también hay una barrera. Pero además de esa barrera del idioma, hay una barrera geográfica que es la inmensa selva del Amazonas. Pasar de Venezuela a Brasil no es lo mismo que pasar de Venezuela a Colombia. Básicamente aquí simplemente o pasas un puente o pasas un río y ya estás en Colombia, ¿sí? Hacia Brasil tendrías que atravesar la selva. Entonces, claramente eso también es una causa para que los migrantes, sobre todo los venezolanos, pues no decidan irse a Brasil. Sin embargo, y hay que decirlo, se mantienen unos flujos migratorios importantes de paraguayos y peruanos hacia Brasil, pero adicionalmente Brasil, y eso hay que reconocerlo, ha hecho un trabajo muy importante en el manejo interno de su migración. Ellos tienen un programa muy valorado a nivel regional que se llama el programa de interiorización, y es que se llevan a los migrantes que están en el norte del Brasil, la gran mayoría venezolanos, a los lugares al interior de Brasil donde se requiere mano de obra. Esos mecanismos, esos flujos de migración laboral interna han sido promovidos desde el Estado y le han dado a Brasil muy buenos créditos, digamos, o resultados en torno a esta respuesta migratoria. Entonces, si bien, digamos, no es un país protagónico por estas razones que les mencionaba, sí ha hecho avances importantes también en estos temas de gestión que ayudan también a impulsar ese nexo, ¿no?, entre migración y desarrollo.
Many thanks, Johanna. I just want to give you the opportunity to read the questions we have, the question we have for Jack McGuire before closing this panel and moving to the next panel. And I'm going to read Jack McGuire's question. It says, 3 interrelated questions. How are interregional immigration deterrence measures, such as the United States working with security policy forces in Mexico and countries in the Northern Triangle to block asylum seekers and other migrants from reaching out the United States, affecting immigration flows in Latin America and the Caribbean? How is it affecting cartels and human smuggling networks who profit off of human movement? What is it doing politically in areas like southern Mexico, where large amounts of migrants are being stopped from continuing north? we have around 4 minutes in this panel, so I'll ask you to be brief, and you're gonna give you the word to every one of you. If you can answer part of the question or the 3 questions at once in one minute, and then also if you want to make some closing remarks. And I will start with Allison, and then Johanna, and then John.
Well, thanks. I'm good to start with because I have very little to say, because as a philosopher, I don't know. Like, these are empirical questions and I don't know. What I would say is, from the philosophical perspective, the question is important because I think what the deterrence regimes speak to is the way in which, what I call my book, the US exporting its immigration policy throughout Latin America, is creating more injustice for these migrants, but also creating injustice against the countries themselves. The United States seems to be enacting a kind of imperialist colonialist viewpoint that these countries exist to serve our interests and that they need to be enforcing our policies. So I think that all these empirical questions are important, but I'd also like to just suggest that it's another way that we can think more broadly about how policies create injustice, not just to a particular immigrant or a particular policy, but in general, how they create unjust dynamics and unjust understandings of the relationships between the countries of Latin America and the United States, for example, and what those countries owe to each other and to the immigrants themselves, and how that affects their internal policies. I think that's a really concerning development.
Thank you, Allison. Johanna?
Gracias, José Miguel. Bueno, yo quisiera enmarcar mi respuesta en lo siguiente, y es que la movilidad humana, por más que tratemos de disminuirla, va a seguir sucediendo. Y cuando se implementan mecanismos de disuasión como estos que mencionan en la pregunta, lo que realmente sucede es que se disparan los canales de migración irregular. Entonces, lo que tenemos es cada vez más migrantes cruzando por las selvas, los ríos, ¿sí? Arriesgando sus vidas, y adicionalmente, y eso se liga con la segunda pregunta que hacían, eso aumenta, por supuesto, el trabajo, por decirlo de alguna manera, de estas redes de tráfico de migrantes, de tráfico de trata de personas, y hacen cada vez más vulnerables a los migrantes. Y hay un poco, y por eso la mirada que también se está haciendo ahora es tratar de trabajar en esas causas raíz, ¿no? de la migración, y es que finalmente la migración pues no sea cada vez es menos voluntaria y más un tema de supervivencia. Al contrario, es mirar precisamente eso, las causas que hacen que la migración se dé y cómo abordarlas para que la decisión de migrar sea cada vez más voluntaria, en ese sentido, más por los canales regulares, y que haga cada vez menos vulnerables a los migrantes.
Gracias, Johanna. John?
Yeah, sure. I agree completely with what Johanna was saying in terms of the impact or lack of impact on in terms of deterrence, as far as stopping migration. It pushes people into more desperate situations, whether it's over the desert area of the U.S. border or the jungles of Panama or what have you. And, I think we know that increased deterrence is a huge benefit for coyotes and other traffickers, because it increases their prices that they can charge. And, to the extent that a deterrence strategy works as a filter, at least, in terms of who might make the decision to migrate, and maybe the young male who wants to go north to simply find a job might be dissuaded. If that's correct, then what we have is that the individuals who are arriving at the border in the context of high levels of deterrence are going to be the most vulnerable, the most desperate, the most victimized by whatever situation they were living in, that they made the decision, despite all of these tools of deterrence, to leave anyway. And that suggests an even greater attention to the needs of the individuals who do make the choice in a deterrence regime to migrate. And so, I think it highlights the very different streams of migration that we're seeing in various parts of the Americas, but it also highlights the need to pay particular attention to those individuals who are able to migrate despite a deterrence strategy, whether it's on the border of Mexico, Guatemala, or the border of US, Mexico. So, yeah.
Thank you, John. And with this, I want to thank you, all of you, John, Johanna, Allison, for an excellent panel about the many migrations in the Americas. So I ask the audience to join me in thanking with an applause, individual applause. And then with this, we finish this panel, and then we start the next panel. Thank you to all of you. And I welcome, and with this, I welcome our next panel. We don't have a break here. We're moving to the next panel, which is about the multiple and endless challenges of migrants and refugees. This is our third panel in this conference on migration. And the idea of the third panel, this third panel, is to focus, or to place the focus on the migrants and the multiple challenges migrants face from different points of view. So we're lucky to have also a great panel, and I'm going to read the biographies of our panelists in this topic, starting with Honorable Lloyd Axworthy, who is the chair of the World Refugee Council and one of Canada's leading voices on global migration and refugee protection. After a 27-year political career where he served as Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Employment and Immigration, among other postings, Mr. Axworthy has continued to work extensively on human security, refugee protection, and human rights in Canada and abroad. He was presented with the Pearson Peace Medal by the Governor General of Canada in May 2017. In his term as President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg, Mr. Axworthy initiated innovative programs for migrant and Aboriginal youth communities, and has also done a great deal of work in refugee reform as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of Germany Robert Bosch Academy. Mr. Axworthy, thank you for participating in this panel. Then we will hear from Randolph McGrorty. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing well. Mr. McGrorty serves as the Executive Director of Catholic Legal Services, Archdiocese of Miami, CLS. He has served as the director since the inception of the agency. In that capacity, he supervises a staff of 45 people, including 22 staff attorneys. Almost 3,000 individuals seek the services of CLS each month. Individuals seeking to reunite with their families, political and religious refugees seeking safety and security, many of whom have experienced persecution and torture, battered spouses and their children, and long-term residents of the US with significant family and community ties who face deportation. He has received proclamations from both the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County recognizing his work on behalf of the immigrant and refugee communities of South Florida. Thank you, Mr. McGrorty. He will be followed by Mariana Sánchez, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Promotion and Disease Prevention, research associate at the Center for Research in U.S. Latino HIV, AIDS, and Drug Abuse at Florida International University. Professor Sánchez has over 20 years of experience in conducting longitudinal and community-based health disparity research across the lifespan, including youth, emerging adults, and adults. She's currently a co-principal investigator of a mixed method study funded by the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, aimed at understanding the environment, demographic, and sociocultural factors influencing drinking and driving trajectories among recent Latino immigrants. She also serves as a co-investigator on the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development ABCD study and the program director for FIU's doctoral program in public health with a concentration in health disparities. Professor Sánchez, thank you for joining us today. And last but not least, Juan Pablo Gordillo, who is a political scientist and a public policy analyst from the National University of Colombia. Gordillo is a former UNDP Regional Citizen Security and Crisis Prevention and Recovery Advisor at UNDP for Latin America and the Caribbean Regional Hub in Panama. Former regional advisor and head of analysis and the regional system of standardized indicators of coexistence and citizen security of the Inter-American Development Bank and the CISALVA Inter-American Development Bank Initiative. He has 16 years of experience of situation analysis, conflict sensitivity, governance, prevention, and policy recommendations to several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, with NGOs such as the IADB, UNDP, GIS, AACD, USAID, among others. Juan Pablo, thank you for joining us too. So the dynamic today in this third panel will be, first we'll hear some remarks from Mr. Axworthy, and then we'll follow with the presentations of Mr. McGrorty, Professor Sánchez, and Professor Gordillo. I remind our audience that we have translation, we have live translation, interpretation. If you look at the bottom at the bottom of your page, you can choose your preferred language over there. And as I said, this panel focuses on the challenges of migrants from the legal point of view, legal status, health, and also what happens with migrants when they are forcibly returned to their countries. With anything else to add, I'll give the floor to Mr. Lloyd Axworthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this dialogue on what is one of the significant regional issues of our time, global issues of our time. As you know, the worldwide figures of people on the move, displaced, is getting close to 85 million. And all the experts indicate that will be doubled within the next 10 years. The World Refugee Migration Council was established at the time of the UN Compacts on Migration and Refugees to be a outside independent sort of center for concrete, practical answers that would give more effective direction to the broad aims and goals of the compacts at the United Nations. And we've had, I think, a 5-year run of a number of initiatives, both in the region and other parts of the world. We've been working in Colombia on setting up private sector funding for housing for migrants from Venezuela. We've been very active on developing a network of girls and women in refugee circumstances and camps so that their voice can be heard and they can begin to developing other routines. And one of the one of the most significant initiatives was our effort to set up a task force on the Americas that would take a look at how, as a region, these measures can be met and solved and discussed, not in a confrontational way or even in a conventional way, but done on the basis of a collaborative way. The co-chairs have been significant political and policy figures. I have to say with great sadness, regret, Madeleine Albright was one of the co-chairs of the task force, which passed away last week, a deep loss for all of us. Laura Chinchillo, former President of Costa Rica, Eduardo Stein, UN, former Vice President of Guatemala, Cardinal Mazarini from Guatemala. I could give you a long list, but we have set out to find a combination of most new research on the impact and conditions that affect migration in the Americas, and come up with, we think, are practical solutions. Now, you may wonder why a Canadian is taking so much interest. Well, let me just give you an example. In my home province of Manitoba, I'm a co-chair of the Immigration Advisory Council there. In Canada, we have close to 300,000 to 400,000 temporary workers who come to Canada every year from the Americas. And because of COVID, we're now facing some very tough, hard realities about the treatment and the organization of recruitment that doesn't really fully recognize the rights of those temporary workers. That's something that is we have to work together with. We've got the same problem as it relates to labor market practices and pathways. So we established this task force, which has about 30 members from Central America, Mexico, United States, and Canada. And our research director, Elizabeth Ferris, I think spoke at this session earlier about the work we're doing. So I won't go into the chapter and verse. What I'd like to focus on is one of the statements we made in our action report of 2019. And we said the migration crisis is not the real crisis. The real crisis is a governance crisis. That the inability to find a sense of responsibility, responsiveness, trust, and effectiveness of governments is one of the real reasons why people in transit are attacked, why displaced persons internally have no protection, while there is virtually no coordinated way of dealing with the impacts of climate, of the changing food security issues, the changing health requirements. And I think it was brought home just how serious it was when Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, about a month and a half ago, made an appeal for a regional mechanism that would help to scale up, coordinate, and create synergies between the different programs, policies, and initiatives dealing with the unprecedented magnitude and complexity of the population movements in Mexico and Central America. That is a pretty big sort of issue to tackle. But we have worked very hard on it, and one of the working groups that was comprised of people from Central America, Mexico, US, and Canada, have looked at various solutions. And we certainly recognized that there were a number of institutional mechanisms that have been working, beginning with the OAS and other areas. But none of them really had a comprehensive or coherent approach. Each were kind of looking at a certain angle, a certain dimension of the problem, but there wasn't an attempt to integrate and coordinate and providing a more comprehensive view, and also being able to ensure that that there was a full participation of inclusion of those who were most affected by what was going on. That's a fundamental principle of our council, is that the people who are most directly affected by refugee migration issues must be involved in the making of decisions about those issues. It's a fundamental sort of principle that we work on. So here is an idea that I want to share with you that came out of the work of the council and particularly of the task force. I should mention, by the way, that the sponsor of the task force is the World Refugee Migration Council, the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, the Inter-American Dialogue, the U.S. Mexico Study Center at San Diego, University of California, the Mexico University, and that we've worked together to provide the resources that have been supplied by governments and foundations and other efforts to do the research. We've been able to commission about 12 very sort of effective new research papers, which, by the way, we'd be glad to share with any of the participants in this program. But those research papers were then taken into workshops that would, again, provide for a rational and serious dialogue. So here is one of the, I think, most important conclusions that I want to focus on. When I was a foreign minister in Canada, I had the responsibility of working on developing a regional mechanism for the Arctic area. Now, I know that the Arctic sounds like an awful long way from Central America, but the reality is there was a number of what we call circumpolar countries who were facing the same problems, all sort of bordering on the Arctic Ocean. And there was no real regime or way in which those could be brought together for discussion and dialogue. It was through a lot of negotiation, and this included Russia, the United States, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, and others. But here was one of the interesting elements. It's the only multilateral institution in the world that actually has invited local people, indigenous people, to be members of that council. They sit around the table just as the foreign ministers do, or the environment ministers, or the resource ministers. And as a result, the council has been able to develop a series of responses, both to climate change, dealing with the impacts on people in the area. He's come up with a series of institutional cooperative arrangements on dealing with tourism, dealing with risk, dealing with transportation, and dealing with health services. It has established its own university, sort of an Arctic Council university, in order to help train people and bring people together. And it's worked on a very light secretariat. This is not a heavy laden administrative system. Each country has an opportunity annually to rotate the chairmanship. Each country provides certain resources and contributions into areas that they're particularly interested in. And even though we're now dealing with the kind of horrendous issue of Russia, and there's members of the council have taken a strong stand asking the Russian delegate to remove themselves, the reality of the past 20 years has been that this has worked in a way that has enabled a fairly high degree of cooperative action taking place with the full participation of people at the community level. So we have taken that model of the Arctic Council and said, why don't we provide or suggest that there be a migration council for the Americas based on the same principles and the same elements, and to provide that kind of membership where there would be an opportunity for participation of indigenous people, of civil society, for the private sector, to be members of the council along with representatives of the governments, that it would work to provide ensuring that the mechanisms would be there to tackle specific problems, would spin out sort of corollary agencies, groups that are able to work on a solution to a problem, bring it back to the council and have it endorsed. And as a result, we have found that over the years, there's been an increasing amount of understanding, increasing amount of effort to protect the interests of people who live in the region. And we're suggesting that in terms of promoting rule of law, providing legal pathways for people who are on the move, providing for protection of their rights while they're in transit, providing support for local civil societies. And we've had, by the way, a very active engagement with the church groups in Central America, Catholic Church, the evangelicals, and others, to work about how the work that they're doing at that level could be integrated as part of this overall program. So we would see that this might provide a model for discussion, examination, and debate within the region to try to find a way of giving it a governance that suits and is appropriate to the scope and complexity of the problems that have been described by Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner. And we put that on the table as one of the areas that coming out of this summit that you've been organized, we'd be interested and willing to have responses about how that might work. We've also, by the way, engaged a fairly active private sector entrepreneurship component where private companies are beginning to look at how they can also channel and direct their investments to provide for the economic development in a way that isn't kind of subject to the corruption, to the kind of sticky fingers that so many dollars are lost by in foreign aid and foreign development assistance. And by the way, I just earlier today had a very major set of meetings on how we deal with in developing an anti-corruption program in certain countries, that we will take frozen assets that are there by sanctions and repurpose them back into the areas and regions and communities that have been victimized by that corruption. So we think that there is room for an innovative and integrated council for the Americas around this issue. And we put that on the table for you to consider. And would be happy to respond to any further questions you have, but also to offer that the work that's gone on in the development of this idea and the research that backs it up is certainly publicly available. And I think in each in your own respective sort of areas of involvement could provide, I think, a very helpful, very constructive response to the idea, and see if it is something about an idea that's time has come. And this, remember, the Summit of the Americas takes place, I think, in June in San Diego. And we would like to see if we could put some of these ideas of a regional collaborative effort and governance system towards that summit to see if we can begin to developing some momentum, some traction towards its implementation. So there's the gist of what I wanted to say. There's other things we're doing, but I think Beth Ferris covered those. But I hope that this gives you some idea of where we think there is room for an innovative governance approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Axworthy, and I completely agree. I mean, the key of the phenomenon has to do with governance, and I think it's particularly urgent to focus on the governance issues that affect our populations. Let me pass the floor to Mr. Randolph McGrorty. Sir, you have the floor now.
Hi, thank you, Jose. Thank you all for your interest in this. I'm not sure how many of you are living and working and enjoying Miami, but Miami is a community that is over 50% foreign born. It is the largest city in the world with the highest level of migration impact. So Miami certainly understands migration. It has been the recipient of migration, and it faces the challenges of migration. In my own specific professional life, I see migrants after they have arrived and are seeking some kind of avenue to legalize, regularize their status here so that they can remain and integrate into our community. I want to focus a little bit on some of the comments of the last panel as it relates to Miami. In Miami, we have a very specific form of migration. Many of you know that's the largest migrant community in Miami remains the Cuban community, and they have been coming to our city, to South Florida, for 60 years in large numbers before that. But the impetus began in the 60s. They have benefited over the years from a very, very permissive immigration law, so that if a Cuban arrives here and is inspected, sort of checked out and allowed to come in, invited in through an admission, it's a legal term that CBP, the authorities review you and invite you in and say, hey, you can stay here for a period of time. There's another mechanism. We don't know who you are, but we think you're okay, so we're going to parole you in. These are two different ways people are invited in. And if a Cuban were admitted or paroled, after a year and a day, they're allowed to become lawful permanent residents and then on to citizenship. And as a community, we have benefited from that. Now, I highlight this because in the other panel, they talked a lot about the push-pull factors of migration. And they, and I think accurately, focused on the push factors as the reason for migration. The pull factors, in my own experience, are less important. And I lift that up because if there were any legal program that would be an incredible magnet for people, it would be the Cuban Adjustment Act, right? I mean, look, if you can get to our borders, present yourself, you're invited in, you get residency and a path to citizenship. And more than that, you're deemed, without having to go through the refugee processing system, you're deemed a refugee, which entitles you to many, many benefits. Public benefits, health benefits. So it sounds to me like an incredibly powerful magnet for migration. And yet we don't see Cubans leaving Cuba in any larger proportion than Haitians or Central Americans. And Miami also attracts a lot of individuals from those sending countries as well. I want to focus a little bit on Haitians, another incredibly important part of our vibrant community here in South Florida. Haitians also have been coming in large numbers for the last 60 years. In many ways, the tale of Cuban and Haitian migration is the story of Miami. And it's almost Dickensian in its tale of two countries, right? So 1959, we know the events in Cuba propelled the Castro regime, and its successor remains in power over 60 years later. It was incredibly repressive for many individuals. They fled. In the early 60s, about 200,000 individuals left Cuba, many of them bound for Miami. They came to the US. They were inspected and admitted because they had a certain privilege called a visa waiver. Cubans in those days could come to the United States without applying for a visa. And so what we did in response to what was happening in Cuba was we allowed them to stay through something called deferred enforced departure. It was an extended way, you know, we know you're going to go back someday, but in the meantime, you can stay here and work. That was all the law allowed back in the 60s. Ultimately, that policy was codified in something called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And that was passed in 1966 for many reasons, for many geopolitical reasons. We were in the height of the Cold War. And so we wanted to lift up America and capitalism and freedom. And so we could demonstrate, in contrast to the communist system, people were trying to flee here and come here. So was wrapped up in all of this, and it had incredible supporters. I'm mindful of the discussion about Colombia, how the Colombian right-wing government is supportive of the Venezuelan refugees who are coming, right? Well, it's a way to embarrass the Maduro regime. So there is a right-wing political motivation, and I would say that same motive was part of the United States policy. Right-wing politicians have long championed Cuban migration. Be that as it may, we have this law, and through the years, almost 2 million Cubans have availed themselves of this very, very, very unique, sustained immigration provision. We saw immigration, though, from Cuba happen in waves. And it didn't happen because of that law, because of the pull. It happened because of events on the islands. So we saw, for example, in 1965, just prior to the Cuban Adjustment Act's passage, a boat lift, Camiaroca, and that was in response to problems on the island in Cuba. And Castro and the regime felt that this was a safety valve for them. They could get rid of dissidents. They could get rid of political opposition by encouraging them to leave Cuba. We saw this happen again in 1980 with the Marielle Boatlift, which today still remains the largest refugee crisis that came to the borders to the United States, 125,000 Cubans arriving in a 6-week period, all of them in South Florida. And again, that was in response to people who were beginning to challenge the Castro regime. He was having internal domestic political problems. And so he used this as a release valve. Then we saw another large spike in Cuban migration in the early 1990s. Well, think of what's going on in the world. The Soviet Union falls. Subsidies from the Soviet Union to Cuba are being greatly, greatly reduced. The economy of Cuba is collapsing. So there was great economic pressures for people to leave the island in the early 90s. And we had what we call the Guantanamo Bay Crisis, where there were 30 to 40,000 Cubans interdicted at sea and brought to Guantanamo Bay. Eventually, they were allowed into the United States. The whole point of this is that the Cuban Adjustment Act has been there and has been available to Cubans, but the migration spiked as a result of what was happening in the sending country. I always call Cuban and Haitian migration twins because they're very, very parallel. So there was an election in 1958 that brought Papa Doc Duvalier to power in Haiti. He actually was popularly elected and he ran as a populist, but he immediately began to clamp down on political opposition. He particularly focused on the intelligentsia, and so Haitians began to leave the island in large numbers in the 60s that increased into the 1970s as repression continued to increase. Now, what is interesting is, again, going back to the twinning of these two countries' migration, we focus on Marielle as a Cuban phenomena, but intermixed with the 125,000 Cubans, 25,000 Haitians also came. They were seeing this, right, this phenomenon, and they also arrived. Now, they didn't have access to the Cuban Adjustment Act, so they had to deal with things a little bit differently. As I said, Cuban migration spiked again in the early 90s. It also spiked for Haitians as the Duvalier regime, Baby Doc, was ending in the late 80s. A newly elected, popularly elected government, President Aristide, was then overthrown incredible repression. 60,000 Haitians take to the seas. Many of them are then also brought to Guantanamo. Of those, 12,000 eventually came to the United States. So we saw in the 90s incredible political repression from Haiti. And it was interesting. This is when I came to Miami and began to work with these two populations. We saw in the early 90s hunger in Cuba as the economy collapsed because of the lack of Soviet subsidies, and incredible political repression in Haiti. They're coming at the same time. Cubans did not have to prove any political motivation or refugee status because they were deemed refugees under the law as long as they were processed, right? Haitians had to prove that. I remember within months of my arrival here, when I began to work with Haitians and Cubans, two events happened. A large boat of Haitians, 300 Haitians, came to Government Key, just a couple blocks from here. They were interdicted by the Coast Guard. All but a few, mainly pregnant women, were allowed to leave the boat and come on land and were paroled in. The rest were summarily deported back to Haiti without any screening for possible persecution if returned, right? At the same time, a Cuban pilot had commandeered a plane, landed this plane on a public street in Miami. This was basically a hijacking. The very next day, he was on the national news media as a freedom fighter and a hero, right? Most likely he was fleeing economic reasons. The Haitians on that boat most likely were fleeing for political motivations, but our deep set mind views and our biases towards these two groups led us to treat them very, very differently, right? So we fast forward to the present time. Cubans and Haitians are still coming. Now, Cubans have a little bit of a change because one of the reasons that we did not deport Haitians back as they were coming was because Cuba would not take them. This was a result of something I think you might all be aware of called wet foot, dry foot. So if a Cuban were able to touch dry land in the US, they were allowed to be processed here, have the benefits of the Cuban Adjustment Act. That changed in the waning days of the Obama administration, about 2 weeks out of the new, at the end, 2 weeks left in the Obama administration. I always say that President Obama used his last terms to deport more people because he changed it. And through an agreement with the Cuban government, Cuba agreed that they would take Cubans back. They would be allowed to repatriate them. So we don't have to allow them in. We could, under the law, repatriate them. Now, in the last 2 years since the pandemic, Cuba has taken no one. So we can't repatriate Cubans right now. So we did allow them to come in, but we didn't follow the protocols. So many of the Cubans who are allowed in were not inspected and admitted or paroled. They were just released. And without that parole document, they cannot avail themselves of the Cuban Adjustment Act, but they continue to come. And again, this gets to my point that it is not so much the immigration policy of the receiving country and deterrence as it is what's going on in the sending country. Cubans are coming in great numbers, despite the fact that it's random. They might be released pursuant to Cuban Adjustment Act. They might not be, but they continue to come. Now we see the phenomenon of Haitians. This administration, through a lot of advocacy, finally decided to grant Haitians temporary protected status. This was a status that Haitians were given after the earthquake for Haitians who had arrived on a certain date. It was met by advocates as an indication that this administration would have a new, more compassionate view of migration. The way TPS works, temporary protected status, it's recognized that there are conditions, generalized conditions of violence, perhaps the result of natural phenomenon like an earthquake or storms. In Haiti's situation, it had all of those, including a cholera pandemic. So there's always a fear by immigration restrictionists that whenever a benefit is given to a certain group, that will engender more migration. And the reality is that as it was granted, in fact, we did see more Haitian migration at the borders. This led to Title 42. Title 42 is not an immigration provision, it's a public health provision. And it allows summary expulsions of individuals who could face who could pose a public health threat. So this has been used against Haitians primarily, not against Cubans. So despite the fact that Haitians face being repatriated virtually a certainty back to their home country, they continue to come. Why? Because the situation in Haiti is incredibly delicate. Again, emphasizing that what is critical to migration is not the immigration policies of the receiving country, but what's going on in the sending countries. So what are we seeing in Miami today, right now? Well, the border is in fact in chaos. The last statistic I saw is apprehensions were about 8,000 a day. About half of those people being apprehended are being summarily expelled or removed to their home country. That's primarily Haitians, Mexicans, and some Central Americans. Of the half that are being let in, half of those individuals are from 3 sending countries: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They're all being admitted in great numbers. Now they're coming to Miami because they have family ties, cultural ties, and social connections to this community. So we are being impacted greatly by what's happening at the border, and they are being processed through a legal system that is incredibly broken. There are almost 2 million immigration court cases pending. The reality is, when these individuals are finally placed into immigration court proceedings to explain to a judge why they should not be deported, it will take years for the conclusion of that case. For those who have never been placed into immigration court proceedings, but seek to file for asylum on their own because that they do face issues of persecution if returned, there's about a 500,000 case backlog in our asylum processing system. Right now, at any given time, there are 10 million pending applications before USCIS for some form of immigration relief that are taking months and years. I'll give you a quick example. Many individuals are eligible for a temporary work permit while they're here, based on a number of different factors. And those temporary work permits are given in increments of a year. It is taking 9 months or more to process applications for employment authorization. And the year increment starts ticking from the date of filing, not from the date it's granted. So we're receiving authorization documentation for clients that have only 2 months left to work, and they're going to have to start all over again. So the system is overwhelmed and incredibly broken. And I really don't, unfortunately, see any pathway forward, because to fix this, it requires some kind of legislation. And there is just no consensus to get any kind of immigration reform through Congress. So what is the future? We're overwhelmed. This past Saturday, we did a very brief Know Your Rights presentation at a parish in Southwest, actually across the street from FIU at St. Agatha Parish. 400 individuals, all of them from Nicaragua, all of them who arrived in the last 2 to 3 months, were present and listened to our presentation. All of them are facing a judge. All of them are in need of a lawyer. It is very unlikely that they will ever get a lawyer, and it's unlikely that their case will be heard in the meantime. And they won't get it in the near future, probably 3 to 4 years, and they're not allowed to work in the meantime. It is reaching a crisis point that we need to deal with, and how we're going to deal with that, I'm not sure there is a political solution. What we do in our office is we do the best we can to help one person at a time, but the numbers are staggering and overwhelming, and there is no way out of this other than immigration reform.
Many thanks, Randy, for that compelling presentation. We'll hear now from Professor Sánchez about the challenges regarding public health of our migrants, especially, I guess, here in South Florida too.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Randy, for that. That was a great talk. And thank you for the great work that you're doing. I have a question, but I guess I'll wait till the end, right, for Randy about his presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I put together a little PowerPoint for you guys. If you can see it. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, I'd like to thank the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center for inviting me to speak today. I'm really happy to be here today and have the opportunity to share some results from my ongoing research with you. So today, I'm just going to be presenting some of the work my research team and I have been doing over the past decade that has focused on recent Latino immigrants, particularly in South Florida. So specifically, I'm going to be presenting some completed and some ongoing research that's focused on pre to post-immigration alcohol use trajectories among recent Latino immigrants. So why is this important? While Latinos don't drink more than other racial ethnic groups, they experience numerous disparities in related to alcohol-related consequences. So Latino men in particular have the highest rates of age-adjusted alcohol-related mortality compared to non-Latino white men, non-Latino white women, Latino women. White Latino men also have the highest rates of alcohol-related cirrhosis of all ethnic racial groups. And additionally, Latinos are also more likely to be involved in alcohol-related crashes, arrests, and DUI-related fatal injuries. Although I would like to know that they are not more likely to drink and drive, they're just more likely to be involved in these consequences, such as arrests and crashes and fatalities. So while Latino immigrants are actually less likely to engage in alcohol misuse compared to US-born Latinos, numerous studies have documented that there's an escalation in alcohol use and misuse as Latinos, as their time in the US increases. So why this happens isn't really well understood. However, we know that the process has been linked to acculturation. So key limitations in the overall literature in this area is that the bulk of the research on Latino alcohol use has been done on drinking behaviors after immigration. And so most of this work has also been collected on Mexican samples that have lived in the US for an extended period, for an extended period of time. And so less is known about, hold on, sorry, my PowerPoint is messing up here. And so less is known about other Latino groups, so specifically those that are predominantly in South Florida, so Cubans, South Americans, and Central Americans. So our research has predominantly focused on pre to post immigration alcohol use trajectories in these Latino subgroups that have been underrepresented in the current literature. One of our original guiding frameworks for our studies has been the healthy immigrant effect. And the healthy immigrant effect is centered around the fact that immigrants on average are healthier than their native-born US counterparts. So this healthy immigrant effect has been largely attributed to selective immigration, right? Whereby those that actually immigrate tend to be healthier and have greater financial means than those that do not have the possibility to migrate. It's been widely posited that lower rates of alcohol misuse among foreign-born Latinos in part is related to this healthy immigrant effect. But it's also important to note that I mentioned that this healthy immigrant effect deteriorates over time, and Latinos tend to engage in more health compromising behaviors as their time in the US increases. So most of our work over the past decade has looked, as I mentioned, pre to post immigration alcohol trajectories over time. Now this particular, the recent Latino immigrant study, this was the first prospective community-based cohort study to examine pre to post immigration alcohol use trajectories. So this study was conducted in Miami, Florida. It consisted of 527 Cuban, South American, and Central American recent immigrants between the ages of 18 and 34. And all of, for inclusion criteria, all of these immigrants had to be in the US for less than 1 year. So our baseline sample, the average time in the US for our sample was 6 months. So starting in 2008, we collected retrospective pre-migration data. So for example, participants reported alcohol use in the 90 days prior to migration. And then we followed them over time across 12 years. And in those subsequent time points, we collected post-immigration alcohol use. So some of the innovative aspects of this study was that we did collect pre-migration alcohol use data. It was a diverse Latino subgroup, and that we were able to really follow them over time, which has now spanned about 12 to 13 years that we've been following this cohort. And we're actually really proud of our retention rates. We've actually had a 95% retention rate over time, over this decade. And, you know, that's completely, I can't take any credit for that. That has been our incredible research team and recruiters and research coordinators that we've actually had working with us this entire time. So it's been a great effort on their part. So what have we found? This figure depicts pre to post immigration alcohol use trajectories in the study sample from 2008 through 2019. So here where you see T1, that represents their pre-migration alcohol use. And then time 2, 3, and 4 represent post-immigration alcohol use. This blue line are the males, and this purple line represents the females. So as you can see, we found decreases in the number of drinking days among men and women during their initial years in the US. But then we found as time in the US increased, and particularly among males, right, their drinking actually increased back to their pre-migration levels. We believe that these decreases in alcohol use during the initial years in the US could potentially be explained by, I think somebody mentioned this earlier, by deterrence, right? So deterrence theory, which states that immigrants willing to go through the stresses of immigration and starting a new life in the US may be deterred, right, from behaviors like alcohol misuse, which could actually place them at greater risk, right, for legal consequences. And in some cases, potential deportation. So once we assume that once their legal status and situations tend to stabilize over time, then their drinking rates tend to increase back to these pre-migration levels. We've actually found the same thing with binge drinking. Here you see there's a couple of additional time points. This is actually a paper in preparation. So here we have, this accounts for about 13 years from pre-immigration to time 7, which is actually the last data collection point that we recently completed in 2020. And so you definitely see these spikes in binge drinking as time in the US increases, even higher than pre-immigration. We've also examined numerous sociocultural factors, right, associated with alcohol use. So some of the protective factors that we found over time is females, undocumented immigrants, those with higher levels of social support, family cohesion, religiosity, those with higher levels of neighborhood collective efficacy actually reported lower alcohol use, where men, documented immigrants, had higher levels of alcohol use. Country of origin was also significant in our findings, where we found that South American and Central Americans were more likely to engage in alcohol use compared to Cuban counterparts. Immigration stress was also a significant contributor to alcohol use, as was higher levels of acculturation, greater adherence to traditional gender norms, such as machismo, and then greater levels of family conflict. I haven't really included any citations here because I kind of tried to do a brief. This presents maybe 30 papers, right? that have been written on these findings. So this is just kind of some brief tidbits of some of these overall findings over the past decade. But I'm happy to share, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to share citations for any of these papers. I also wanted to share with you another ongoing longitudinal study that's funded by the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism from NIH. And this one is fairly new, and this is examining drinking and driving among young adult recent Latino immigrants. And specifically, it's examining the impact of transportation and alcohol use on drinking and driving, and how some of these moderating sociocultural factors, may impact and moderate these associations. So we examined a lot of the sociocultural factors I just mentioned, as well as some additional things that had to do with ethnic identity and subjective social status. So we're currently in the process of collecting this data. We started in 2019. And we use the same inclusion criteria. So these were all recent Latino immigrants that just arrived in the US within the past year, 18 to 34. And then we've been following them over time, 1 year apart. And so we're actually in the process of finishing up our 2022 last wave of data collection. So we're happy about that. So similar to the recent immigrant study, we are also finding that there's decreases in drinking and driving among this sample. And interestingly, data from this new study, since it had the same inclusion criteria, it really allowed us to kind of compare differences in migration patterns, right? From 2009 immigrants to 2019 immigrants. And we're really finding a lot, when you compare and contrast these samples, they're just so different. And this is very indicative of the migration patterns and these changes in migration patterns that have happened over the past decade. So I won't share too much because there's a lot to say, but overall, as you can see from this table, there's definitely distinct differences in the composition of the samples, right, regarding country of origin. In the 2009 sample, you can see that it was predominantly Cuban. So we had 222 Cubans. In our newer sample, we only have 51. And really the predominant the predominant participants in the sample were South American. And this really constitutes largely Venezuelan recent immigrants. So we've had large influxes of recent immigrants to the point that we actually had to stop recruiting Venezuelans because we could have literally had an entire Venezuelan sample because there's just so the influx of the recent immigrants within that age group were just so large. So some of I didn't really show it in this table, but what we have found, and this is actually similar to what Randy was speaking about, we have found that the rates of immigration stress among Cubans has been significantly higher. So we found significantly higher rates of fears of deportation in the sample, and obviously we've assumed that this has to do with this repeal, right, of the Wet Foot Dry Foot Act. And also we found something quite interesting. Mind you, this is only a subsample of 51, right, that we have in our new study, but we've found substantially higher levels of pre and post immigration alcohol use among Cuban women. in this new sample. So it's definitely something that we're interested in exploring, but substantially higher rates. I'm talking like from 15% to like 72% of Cuban women reporting binge drinking pre-migration and post-migration. So definitely something that we'd like to continue to explore further down the line. And lastly, this is another paper that we have in progress, and this is also from this new sample that I wanted to share with you. And here we have, we examined latent subgroups of recent Latino immigrants, and it examines patterns of alcohol use while accounting for pre and post-immigration stress and trauma. So these analyses, like I said, were conducted with the new sample. And what we found was there were 4 classes really of recent immigrants as it relates to trauma and stress. So we found this high stress, high trauma group. So this is that red line here. We found another subgroup of immigrants that had high immigration stress, but low pre-migration and migration trauma. Then we found another group that had low levels of immigration stress, but high levels of pre-migration and migration trauma. And then we found this subset in the purple, which is those immigrants that had low stress and low trauma. So basically, this research, what this study substantiated that for many individuals, the immigration process can certainly be stressful, right? And it can be definitely a traumatic experience. For instance, while only one fifth of the sample that were identified as were in the low stress, low trauma group, close to half of the sample was allocated in the high stress and high trauma group. So, which really speaks to the substantial hardships, right, that recent immigrants face, particularly in the context of forced migration and trauma. Now, interestingly and unexpectedly, we found that participants who reported relatively low levels of stress and migration trauma were significantly more likely to report greater alcohol use relative to those that had high levels of trauma and immigration stress, which was kind of counter to what we had anticipated. We suspect that these findings are related to those that have experienced migration trauma, are also likely those that are seeking asylum in the U.S. So as such, that they may be reluctant, right, to engage in risk behavior such as alcohol use for fears of coming into contact with law enforcement or risking their residency status or their asylum petitions. So these findings, I think, also, right, fall in line with deterrence theory, right, which suggests that immigrants may engage in lower levels of risk behaviors in an effort to reduce or avoid legal encounters due to their immigration status. We think that perhaps like a desire for prosperity and well-being brings a decrease, right, in health compromising behaviors that may have been part of their lives left behind in their country of origin. So perhaps for immigrants willing to go through these, pre to post immigration stressors and all the difficulties involved in the immigration experience, these things may and also this prospect of new beginnings, right, may actually deter them from engaging in alcohol use and potentially other risk behaviors. So key findings in our studies indicate that changes in risk and protective sociocultural factors after immigration may influence differential alcohol use trajectories for recent Latino immigrants. And these actual results run counter, right, to previous research, including the healthy immigrant effect, that suggests that which suggests the opportunity for new theoretical frameworks, right, that indicate immigration to the U.S. may actually have health promoting effects for recent immigrants in regards to alcohol use and potentially other risk behaviors, and may not have that linear trajectory of worsening health outcomes that previous literature has noted and documented. So our findings also indicate that maybe early in the immigration process is really it's a significant time of transition and stress, but it also may provide an opportunity, right, to engage recent immigrants in early interventions and programs to prevent escalations in alcohol use and other health compromising behaviors. So as immigration policies and our nation's socio-political climate continues to evolve, there's going to be a need for future research that further examines shifts and patterns of Latino immigration. For instance, under current President Joe Biden's administration, Venezuelans were recently in 2021, I believe, granted temporary protected status, TPS, making them eligible to have reprieve from deportation under this policy. So specifically, the problem, as Randy had mentioned, the program provides immigrants from select countries time-limited permission to live and work in the U.S. So really, it remains to be seen how these newly protected status will impact the context of immigration and immigration stress and alcohol use behaviors among Venezuelan recent immigrants. Future research is also needed to explore how the context, right, of the receiving immigrant community may impact immigration stress and alcohol use. Less established immigrant receiving communities often lack the resources and support systems available in more established host settings like Miami, which also may lead to differential and higher levels of stress among newly arrived immigrants in newer receiving communities such as those in Maryland or North Carolina. So given the dearth in the area, findings from our studies provide an important vantage point into distinct experiences of recent Latino immigrants and can serve to provide fresh insights into future research, programs, and policies that target this population. Some of the things that we're we have preliminary data on has been cigarette use and e-cigarette use in this population. So we found really high levels of pre-immigration cigarette use. So about 27% of our sample reported cigarette use prior to migration, and then we found steep declines. So that's one thing that we wanted to look into over time and see if this kind of follows that same U-shaped pattern over time, that they may decrease cigarette and e-cigarette use, and it may increase over time. We've also found really high rates of adverse mental health outcomes in our new sample in particular. And we attribute this probably to these high rates, right, particularly among the Venezuelan immigrants, these high rates of forced migration and migration trauma. So about a little bit over 60% of our sample were actually at risk for clinical depression. So this is something that we want to follow and explore further, like how, what are some ways that we can maybe like ameliorate these adverse mental health consequences that are associated with forced migration and migration trauma. So that's it. I'd like to thank my collaborators at Cruzada, at the Pacific Institute at Research and Evaluation, that's a co-PI, Eduardo Romano, and our great work of Rosa Albino and Dana Gutierrez, which have been the key people that have been our research coordinators that have been, working with these samples for over a decade.
Thank you, Mariana, for a fascinating presentation. Let me turn the floor now to Juan Pablo Gordillo, who's going to talk about the challenges, especially in the home countries for migrants. Juan
Thank
Pablo?
you, José Miguel, and thank you to all the colleagues that have been before me in this excellent panel. I want to share with you our experience from UNDP, starting in Central America, but also in Latin America. I would like to talk about the endless challenges that they face in the host countries and the host communities. Obviously, our analysis framework will be from the point of view of human rights, the migrant and the migration as a right for everyone, but also thinking that we should envision that migration is here for long term, let's say. The people on the move are going to be here and they're going to stay. So we need to think in the long term on policies that envision also development along with migration, along with asylum seekers, along with all the refugees that are going across the region and across the different countries that are seeking for protection, for new boundaries, new opportunities. And that point of view is our starting point of view. I just want to remark that we made a study and we have been conducting from Infosegura, that is a regional project of UNDP, we have been conducting several studies on migration, its relationship with citizen security and with development, thinking from the prevention point of view. And that it's important because we're thinking how to work and how to enhance this governance crisis that our colleague, the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy mentioned at the beginning of this panel. The migration in Latin America, it's a governance crisis, and that is a strong message. So it needs also an effective governance approach. I will present to you Laura. Laura is a 19-year-old girl that lives in Soyapango in El Salvador. For those that doesn't know El Salvador, Soyapango is one of the most and highly affected parts of the metropolitan area of San Salvador, affected by violence. And not only because of homicides, but also because of other events such as femicides, extortions, robbery, vehicle with merchandise robbery, and other risk factors that were stated in the 2017 prioritization index that UNDP conducted with the government of El Salvador. And it was identified as a high insecurity territory in El Salvador. So this is our starting point. Laura lives there. She has a lot of insecurity at home. She had a lot of pressure, a lack of opportunities, a lack of a total pressure of vulnerabilities, such as lack of education, lack of work opportunities. So she's on the move right now. She started the involuntary migration cycle, and she initiates at first moving inside the country as an IDP. She started moving to other municipalities within El Salvador, and she goes after that seeking the north. Her family sent her some remittances to start the migration route to the north, seeking for the US, as she has a family. This is a strong pull factor for migration in the region, but also she has a lot of pressures to use the irregular mechanisms to take the route. Let's say the highly effective coyotes across the region have taken contact with Laura, and Laura paid between 7,000 US and 11,000 US to reach the US. So she's on the irregular route to the US, and she's exposed to heterogeneous risk factors across the whole road. And then when she arrives there, she has been put in the returnees list as she was captured in the border, and she is going to be returned to Central America. So our story of Laura shows us that she started with an expulsion and a push factor from their host country, that is violence and insecurity. But not only violence and insecurity, Laura also received some money from people that live from her family in the US. That is a pull factor, family reunification. But also she is seeking for economic opportunities for her that she's not finding here in El Salvador, in Soyapango, those opportunities. So what we are seeing from data, and UNDP has been making this kind of analysis, is that violence and insecurity is just the third level cause for migration to the US. We find out that there is a mixture between economic opportunities, family reunification, and violence and insecurity that push the people to get to the US. Also, Laura has been in Soyapango a victim of several crimes, and she has been witnessing different crimes in her community. So if we take into account the latest information from the Latino Barometer and also from the Culture Peace Survey of El Salvador, what we have found is that 3 out of 10 inhabitants of the countries in Northern Central America have thought of living in another country, especially in the US. In El Salvador, what you found is like Laura, that has been a victim several times of different crimes, robbery, theft, and also some sexual violence in the public transportation. What we have found is that they're at higher risk in their communities. So they try to take the involuntary route for migration in a higher rate than men. But that's due because their decision is more effective than men at the beginning because of the sexual risks that they are facing in the different public spaces in El Salvador. Despite that you have been hearing that there is a homicide regional reduction since 2015, and UNDP-Infosegura has found that it is almost below the rate of the average Latin American countries homicide rate, there has been an atypical year in 2020 and in 2021, because what we are seeing is that it is starting to rise. It's starting to have another peak, and that's due to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 crisis. A lack of opportunities, a lack of different access to services in their communities. Like Laura, they are trying again to find the migration route to the north. So as also in the previous panel, they stated the different COVID-19 policies that have been in place in the Northern Triangle and in several other countries in Latin America. We have found that the border closures and other complex measures to tackle COVID-19 have intensified the risks for the migrants, for example, living with their partners, and they are exposed to sexual violence, to household violence, to intrafamiliar violence, that rises their willing to migrate to the US or to get again with their family that is living in the US. That has shown the data over the last 2 years. So that is impacting their willing to migrate to the north. Also, if we take into account that almost 1 million people have been involuntary returned from the US between 2016 and 2021, that million of people is going to take again the migration route, because as we stated before, coyotes offer you 3 times to reach the border of the US, and you pay 11,000 US according to the analysis of UNODC, and also to the traffic and human trafficking analysis of the last year. They're telling that the prices have risen. So if they rise, it's because not a lot of people was reaching the border of the US, but they paid for 3 different times to get there. And those 3 different times might be this year, by the end of the year, depending on their willing to get again into the route and into the coyotes route. So we are trying to see that more than 1 million of people are fleeing the countries of the northern countries of Central America. So like Laura, 2 in every 10 people that are returnees are women. So they are exposed to sexual violence, to femicide, and to other kind of felonies and crimes across the migration route. So she's facing a lot of vulnerabilities, and she's facing, when she's getting this return to her home country, she's facing higher risks because she has been already in contact in different other countries with illegal migration routes, with illegal coyotes, with illegal gangs, and migration, forced migration, let's say like suppliers that are in that underworld of crime and let's say that are part of a broader network of violent associates that make easier to migrate to the US. In the last year, it's important to notice that the level of migrants and returnees from Mexico have turned. The returnees from Mexico were lower before the pandemic and higher from the US. But after the pandemic, they are higher from Mexico and lower from the US. So more people are coming back from Mexico. The law enforcement policies in Mexico have been really impactful to return people to the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, and they're returning a lot of women like Laura. So migration involves a requirement to expand the capacities of the people back at home, back at their territories. They need to to gain work, to gain education, and several other services that they need to find at the home countries. That's why I'm totally agree with Mr. Axworthy that the governance crisis is a crisis of trust, of violence, of services, and we need to strengthen those services, those development services, to take care of these people that already are returning from Mexico or from the US. In other cases, in Colombia, in the southern corner of Latin America, there is also several examples of returnees to their home countries, and they need also a lot of services that need to be strengthened back at home. Let's say that in 2015 and 2020, between 2020 and 2015, there were more than 687,000 asylum applications. So people are still fleeing and seeking for new applications beyond their countries. So there is a need to work not only with the countries, but in a regional level to try to tackle at first the internal displacement as the first step to take the migration route, to work regionally to get some opportunities to those people that are across the three countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and how to strengthen the development policies back at those countries. If we seek the data, we will find out that 55% of the IDPs were intra-municipal between municipalities in the Northern Triangle. Only the 28% were interdepartmental across the departments in the different countries. And if we see this, we will find out that there is the million people that have been returned, plus the 560,000 people that are IDPs in the region. We will find out that 1.5 million of people have been exposed to several risks in the different parts of the three countries, all due to a lack of development capacities and a lack of services. But what happens back at home? What are those faces that we got back at home? So the returnees are still facing violence in their communities. They try to reach their families in their host communities. They try to get some networks again to be reinserted to work in networks, but they face like a stigma that they are returnees, that they have been in the migration route and they cannot be here. Probably that they got money after they go to the US and being returned. So sometimes they are extorted and they are facing extortion in their communities and to their families. So they are exposed to get on the move internally because they cannot pay anymore. They need to leave their communities. Also, if we take a look, they also face dangers such as disappearances and other risks back at home, not only at the migration route, but also back at home. When they cannot pay the fee or they cannot get into the gangs mechanisms to pay back that she's now in the community, but she has to pay back to the gangs like a extortion rate. She is in danger or to get disappeared, to be extorted, to be sexual violence, or in other cases, just to move to other country to try to find out a new life. It hasn't had to be on the north, but sometimes they change across the borders from El Salvador to Guatemala, or from Guatemala to Honduras, or from Honduras to Guatemala. But still, as the illegal network is there, they're facing a high risk of being victim of another crime in the region. After we conducted several studies of homicide and the other vulnerabilities that we have found in 3 countries, what we have done is this characterization where we found that 19 municipalities in Guatemala account of 20% of the returns and 39% of the homicides. So people mostly are returning to violent municipalities and are facing violence or be witnessing violence at their communities. In El Salvador, we found out that 21 municipalities account 39 of returns, but 25% of homicides. It's lower than in Guatemala. So that is an indicator that in Guatemala, the level of violence of the host communities is higher than in El Salvador, but the people that is returning to El Salvador is higher than in Guatemala. So we have to take into account where are they returning, which are those municipalities that they are returning to try to tackle violence as a priority in those municipalities. In the case of Honduras, we found the same thing than in Guatemala, but we find out that is 51% of returns, but also 51% of homicides. So the challenge is not only to fight for those people who are willing to take the migration route, but also to fight the crimes back at home. So when Laura gets back to Soyapango with her family, she's finding also that in her host territory, she has a perceived risk higher than when she left. She's finding higher aggressions to human rights violations, not only due to the illegal networks or to the criminal networks in the territories, but also due to police, due to other institutional forces that have presence in the territories, and they have a lack of respect of human rights violations. Also, Laura is facing a stigma and let's say like a xenophobia back at home. When you ask in Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, if the arrival of migrants harms the community or not, what we have found is that in the case of Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, the perception is that the arrival of migrants harms the community. So there is a stigma that those migrants or returnees that are coming back to the host communities may expose the community or may be a risk to the community. Also, in a study that we conducted 2 years ago with more than 9,500 youths, we find out that if you have been witnessing violence in your community, if you have been witnessing violence at your school, violence at home, you are twice exposed to take the migration route. You will be two times more willing to migrate to the north, and especially when you face victimization or you witness violence in the communities. The level of youths that are willing to migrate are higher when they witness violence in their communities and in their schools. Also, Laura is facing some, let's say, risk factors at home. In the case of this study that we conducted, families in conflict situations due to violence are almost around 15% in the 3 countries. 36% of households had female heads, and they're over 30 years at the productive age, but led only by women. 46% of households were in charge of other kids and other youths. So the family is not the traditional family. And that also puts the extended family into risk, because many times they live with some far siblings or with some uncles and other family members that sometimes put in risk the people at home due to sexual violence or other kinds of abuses at home. So when Laura is facing back at home those vulnerabilities, not only violence, sexual violence, household violence, community violence, witnessing violence, which other kind of affections and vulnerabilities is she facing? Also, as Mr. Lloyd stated, she's facing food insecurity. We have in the dry corridor a lot of spaces with food insecurity. 2 of every 10 inhabitants in Northern Central America face these kind of vulnerabilities. They have heavy losses, as we found out the last 2020, due to hurricanes and other, let's say, crises due to the climate change, and they don't have any kind of livelihoods after these events. So they're pushed again to the migration route, and they're pushed again to take this risk to get to the US to find out other kind of opportunities also due to the climate change. So if we find out in all these kinds of vulnerabilities for Laura, she's also facing a higher vulnerability that is the inequality and the poverty in the region. The region has been stacked around the last 10 years in the levels of poverty. The levels of inequality are rising over the last 3 years, according to the UNDP. So the situation is being in a sort of deterioration. And we found out, according to ECLAC, that that's 51% of the population fall into extreme poverty over the last 2 years. So we will need 20 years to get out of this extreme poverty fall back. And also, if we take a look of the Gini index and the young people that is trying to find out work and education, we find out that the indicators are far behind than the average that were before the pandemic. So Laura, without study, with a lot of violence, with a lot of vulnerabilities, climate crisis vulnerabilities, and a lot of pressure in her host community, she faces the multiple challenges to get a decent kind of life, a set of capabilities, and to put in action her agency for her community. So that lack of opportunities is reflected in taking again the migration route. So we need to think in longer term opportunities to expand their life choices, their opportunities, their civic space, regain the boundaries of their territories, but regain that social cohesion inner their family, their immediate community, and in her neighborhood. We need to discourage the cross-border forced displacement and the IDPs across the region to lower the levels of irregular migration to the US. So if we tackle IDPs and we work jointly with the government and with the host municipalities, strengthening development programs, we should be able to lower the cross-border displacement and also the migration to the US and also to Mexico. And in a third level, we need to integrate the citizen security perspective and the effective governance perspective to avoid conflict and start working on peace building, start working again on trust in the institutions, start working again on the provision of key services to the population. And local governments are key, and they have a key role to responding on this challenge. A local comprehensive care policy may be a good idea for them. And integration and multidimensional response to women that are head of families in that communities and providing supplementary programs of food and opportunities should be important to tackle the irregular migration to the north. And also identifying the programming and coordinating actions between local governments and national governments to respond to the migration crisis. So to end, I will say that from UNDP, we're trying to change the point of view of the host communities and try to foster and to develop resilience-based development. Resilience for their territories, like Laura in Soyapango, trying to tackle the negative drivers, the risk factors, trying to work on the lack of planning to integrate migrations and internally displaced people into the actions of the local governments to work with them, trying to tackle the lack of capacities of local levels to cope, recover, and sustain development, working on these assets or these capabilities to enhance LoRa action in her territory, and also to work on the absence on a community level interaction to try to reintegrate and work on social cohesion with the communities, try to work on regain those boundaries to develop new networks of support for people like Laura. So that is the approach that we are taking, and we hope that, as I stated at the beginning, I think that migration is here to come, and we need to think from a developmental point of view to tackle it and to work with it. And well, thank you to all of you.
Many thanks, Juan Pablo, for this comprehensive view about the challenges of migrants, even back to their home countries, and how how long the threat of migration is and the implications. So we have around 25 minutes for Q&A. So I invite our audience, our public, to submit your questions using the Q&A button. Unfortunately, Ambassador Axworthy had to leave to attend another appointment. So any question to our present panelists will be more than welcome. In the meantime, I have my questions for you. In the meantime, and I would like to address a little bit these questions about, you know, the sort of gender impact of gender challenges. Randy talked a lot about, you know, the in some ways sort of the differential treatment of migrants, you know, based on Muslim nationality here in Miami, right? My question for you is whether is there any differential treatment and or challenges in terms of gender? Is the system more, you talked about the system being basically broken, and that's, you know, that's we all see that, but does the system work better, if we can say that, for some groups than others in terms of gender or even in terms of age or age groups? Yeah, so.
Sure. So, you know, in the title of the panel, we talk about migrants and refugees, and that's largely definitional, right? And it's a huge, so, you know, we talk about the irregular entries. Many of them are seeking refugee status. So they want to move from a migrant to a refugee. And I raise that because our own refugee law is based on international law. And you know, the 1951 Refugee Convention was very specific and actually really only dealt with the World War II populations, both in definition and in time. And it wasn't expanded till 1967 that replaced the geography and the time limits of refugee status. So it gets to this point. So to win your asylum claim here, to win refugee status abroad, you have to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 categories: political opinion, nationality, ethnic origin, race, or something called social group. This was a large, expansive group, and this is where a lot of litigation is. What is a social group that could face persecution? A classic would be a sexual minority, right? You're going to be persecuted because you're gay in your home country. That's an immutable characteristic. You can't change that, and you shouldn't have to change that in order to avoid persecution. Now, I bring this up because women, for many reasons, in many cultures, don't engage in traditional politics that are recognizable on how we define asylum. So they might have a more difficult time in proving a traditional political asylum claim. But what's more important is that many women, by virtue of their status as a woman, face persecution in their home countries. And so there has been some evolution of this, but just coming to the United States saying that you're a woman and you're going to face persecution because of your status as a woman is not a winning claim right now, right? So to some extent, I would say that that is very unfair because it's well documented that women do face persecution simply because of their status as women in certain cultures, right? So I do think that our asylum law is somewhat biased against women in that regard. So women do have a more difficult time proving it. Women also come many times with their family. And so even practically, that is much more difficult. You know, we see in our, right now, I could probably walk out to our lobby and I would see moms with their kids. It's just harder for them to get to our office and to secure representation. So there are all of those sort of practical, nitty-gritty, day-to-day challenges that women face that a young single male might not. Families, you know, it's far easier for us to place a single male homeless person with temporary shelter than a family, for example. So on and on, we see that while the law doesn't specifically disparately treat women from men, in practical terms, in reality, it is a very disparate treatment.
Thank you. While you were speaking, MLB Beizaga asked, what about sexual minorities? I think you addressed a little bit that at the beginning.
Right. So sexual minorities under the law could claim asylum, depending on the circumstances of their home country. And that would fit under this group, under the category of social group.
Thank you. I have also related question. Go ahead, Mariana.
Sure. No, go ahead. You can go ahead and I'll
Well, I have a question for you and also a question on Juan Pablo. So let me make the question to Juan Pablo and then I'll you know. So Juan Pablo, related to the same topic, you show us, the sort of the journey of Laura, right, which is a woman, but I'm not sure I saw. I mean, is there differences in the way that the challenges in the line of what Randy was saying, the challenges that return immigrants to our countries are treated, whether they are females or males, do they face the same? I guess not, right? The same kind of challenges that are different, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah,
in terms
thank
of
you so
gender?
much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Jose Miguel. I mean, this is really important because we shown the case of Laura because, as Randolph remarked, women faces several other challenges, not only due to maternity, due to the links with their families. Sometimes their mother is in the US and they got to find out again that linkage with their direct family and with their children that probably has been with their grandmother in the US, or several cases that put in the case different challenges for women. But men also, and I mean, every 8 of every 10 returnees are men. And men face a key challenge in their host communities, and it's the stigma due to the gangs. Sometimes they cannot live the pressure of a gang. And the gang, as in several studies that also you have conducted several of them, gangs do not make easier the people to leave the gang, to flee the gang. If you have once collaborated with them and you are a young boy or a boy, they will let you in their lines like forever. It's hard to leave them. And sometimes with some religious groups and with some other alternatives, they try to face a way out of the gang. They have found a lot of pressure, a lot of stigma, a lot of vulnerabilities, especially disappearances, especially homicide. And in some cases also, they are mutilated and affected to the whole life. So there are several, even as Mariana stated, mental health problems for them for all their lives. So you find out that youth males are also exposed to other kinds of challenges due to violence, due to economic lack of opportunities, due to also a lack of that social tissue that enables them to get reinserted to their host communities. And it's because you face that, for example, in a standard job, they ask you the ID. And sometimes the ID has the address of the person. And if you are from a high-risk community, you wouldn't have that work. Some jobs are lost due to where do you live or from where do you are. If you are from Soyapango, from Ilopango, from other metropolitan areas that are identified as a high risk, you will be left out and left behind of that work opportunity. So challenges are also faced by men. And I just want to highlight the women's case, because what we have found is that the linkages for the pull factors from the US are higher on those families that were stated at the beginning from women, because women try to pull their kids, to pull their brothers, their siblings, and in many cases, men aren't as effective pulling them or justifying how to pull them to the US than in the case of women. So I will say that yes, both face different challenges in the host communities and in the case of the pull factors.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Mariana, my question for you very quickly is, I found really interesting the differences in terms of gender, again, in the alcohol consumption in the migrants after a while, right? How males basically recover the levels of consumption, whereas in the case of females, basically they kept going down. Any reason, particularly in the case of women, why they keep going down? Like,
sure.
Yes.
So we are, well, I will say that we are finding now, as we're reaching into our 12th and 13th year, that these levels are escalating now.
Okay.
I think that probably the lower levels were likely to do with things related to like gender norms, right, among Latina women, and how drinking is not necessarily as socially acceptable in Latin America. And so these changes and these shifts in these gender norms probably take a longer time to really begin to impact. But we are finding, particularly with binge drinking, that they are increasing, over time. But what we actually found were the substantial decreases were just significant among men, because the women tended to stay fairly level over time. But we are certainly finding increases over time now into a decade, and we anticipate it has to do with gender norms.
Thank you. And you had a comment or a question before. So
yeah, it was actually for Randy. I was wondering, Randy, you had mentioned about how changes in the Wet Foot, Dry Foot Act regarding immigration status and the Cuban immigrants. I'm wondering if anecdotally in your experience, if you can maybe talk a little bit about the changes in the Cuban experience, and or if there has been changes that you've noticed regarding recent Cuban immigrants. I'm just kind of trying to put it in context with some of the things that I'm finding in my research regarding increases in fear of deportation. So I'm wondering if you too have found this in the people that you are providing services for.
So it's interesting. Your studies are going to reflect a more of a longitudinal result of this new phenomenon. I can tell you only sort of a more instantaneous view, which is, so first of all, we had this significant change in the way that Cubans are processed from 2017 onward. So we're about 5 years into that policy. The result of that policy is, for the first time in 6 decades, Miami in the United States, but Miami being the epicenter of this phenomenon, will have an extremely large number of Cuban migrants without immigration status. So that, unless that's cleaned up, they're going to probably, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but they will probably be reflected in your studies as similar to other groups without a pathway to some kind of permanent status here in the United States. Cuban migration right now is at a very, very, very high level. And it is kind of random who is getting processed under the old system and who is getting processed under the new system. The concept of parole still exists in our law, and it's discretionary, and the border authorities could parole everyone. They could parole Cubans as they did up to January 2017. The border right now is extremely chaotic. They're overwhelmed and they're just releasing people. Now, there are some proposals going forward. Some of you might have heard that there's a major reform that this administration is going to try, which is that everyone at the border will be given a credible fear interview to see if they might face persecution upon return. If they pass that, it seems that they will be paroled into the United States. So assuming Cubans do express a fear of persecution and pass the credible fear test, they then would be paroled, which would then set them on the path to the pre-2017 processing of Cubans. So we could return to pre-2017, we don't know. But right now we know that these last 5 years has created a large group of thousands and thousands of Cubans without a path to a regular immigration status like other groups. But I'm sorry, I just wanted to pick up Juan Pablo said something really important about young males and the fear of gangs. And I want to lift that up and highlight that as another aspect of how our immigration law, while not entirely inelastic, so we sort of change and evolve immigration law through lawsuits, it is certainly not responsive to contemporary situations. So Juan Pablo, you mentioned gangs. It's a word that we don't like to use in our office because I feel that a gang in the American context conjures up something other than what is the phenomenon in Central America right now. These gangs are intricate institutions right now. They have stepped into a void where there is no functioning government. They're acting as the government, but we're stuck with an old idea of gangs and gang recruitment. And that has been explicitly rejected as a basis for political asylum. And yet their risk of danger, a young male who has tried to escape from the gangs, is incredibly, incredibly high, right? So we have had to use, Juan Pablo, you had mentioned one of the ways that they could escape is sometimes through a religious community, sort of embracing them. We have kind of coupled gang recruitment with this concept that they were involved in a youth group at their local parish and that their religious belief leads them to reject gangs and gang violence. And we've been able to win under that category of asylum, but not as fear of persecution from gangs. So it's very interesting. It's another example how the realities of modern life have not yet been reflected in immigration law, because those young males are very, very highly at risk and should be protected.
Thank you, Randy. I want to be respectful of your time on the audience time, and I don't want to close without addressing this question that come through our Q&A. And this question will be a great gateway for you to give you opportunity to also to give your closing remarks in this panel. So I'm going to read the question and I'll let you respond. Each one of you respond to the question. I am enjoying this panel very much, thanks. While reasons for emigrate were discussed, I'd appreciate if you could comment about the migrants' expectations. Clearly they differ for those who are forced to migrate, those who escape physical and mental hardship and so on. But regardless, each migrant has expectations of how life in the US would be. How does this expectation and the failure to achieve this expectation affect lives and decisions making in the US? This also relates to resilience, of course. Thank you. So if you could please briefly answer your question, this question, and I'll follow with Juan Pablo, Mariana, and then Randy. Juan Pablo?
Yes, thank you, José Miguel. I will say that one of the highest expectations of the people that are fleeing to the US and trying to get a new life is agency. And the word is agency. They want to recover their capability to decide on their lives, to decide with their families, to regain the boundaries lost with families in the US or in other country. Also, they need to regain the capacity to work and to develop a career, because that gives them agency. And also there is and Randy remarked this part, there is a new cultural challenge. They want to break that culture in their communities, that is the culture of violence, the culture of the closed community, that it's almost like encapsulated in the gang dynamic, in the culture of the illegal market, of the extortion, of the cooptation of the police force, of the magistrate, and that level of lack of opportunity to develop agency and other gain services like education, quality of education, quality of work, quality of health, because always it is mediated and depends on other agents, maybe on a non-regular state agent or in a gang or in any other agent at the local level. So I think that that agency will be the main worry of the people that are taking the migration route, that they envision to gain that capacity to have agency.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Mariana?
Sure. I agree with Juan Pablo that, you know, just regaining agency is very important. We've found in our studies, particularly the newer study, is that this idea of social status. So particularly with Venezuelans, right? We have a lot of Venezuelans in our studies that in their home country were doctors and lawyers and engineers. And they come to the US and they're, you know, Uber drivers or dishwashers, or, you know, and they're really, there was an impact, and it's kind of like this decrease, right, of agency and this decrease of social status. And that has really impacted, it's had adverse mental health consequences, right? So I think, and people that have come to the US with lower subjective social status and then have found increases, actually, so there's improved benefits with regards to mental health and overall well-being. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed, particularly early in the immigration process. It is really helping some of these particularly recent immigrants regain agency, particularly if that's been lost in this pre to post immigration experience.
Thank you, Mariana. Randy?
This is not something, this is outside my professional competency, right? We have a very limited mission. We try to make the law work for people regardless of their expectations or motivations. Having done this for a very long time, I can tell you as a person that I very much see the reality of life in the United States as different from their expectations. And I think that many migrants who have made this difficult journey and are trying to join our community, they see life as very different than they expected it, and very difficult. I reflect on that as a native-born American, and I see their disappointment as a call for all of us to make America what those migrants envision it to be. It's a call for all of us to be better and to create the just, open, caring society that the migrants think America is supposed to be.
Thank you so much, Randy, and thank you for your words that serve as a closing statement here for this panel. I want to thank you, all of you, and also Ambassador Axworthy for your presentation, for your remarks. It's been a great panel, and I also want to thank all the people in the public. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for more questions. We have been, for those of you who have been with us from the beginning of the day today, it's been a very fruitful and productive day talking about migration. We'll continue tomorrow with the projection of the film, projection of the documentary from the vertical border, followed by a discussion with the director, Sonia Wolf. So again, thank you everyone for a great day discussing things that affect us all. And with that, I close the day today, and have everybody a good night. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.